For generations, historians have tended to view mountainous regions as isolated backwaters standing on the margins of civilization. But what if these landscapes were not simply left behind by history? What if the people who lived there actively chose a different way of life? Anthropologist James C. Scott challenged conventional thinking with this bold idea in The Art of Not Being Governed. His work focuses on a vast upland region of Southeast Asia that he calls Zomia, an enormous mountainous zone stretching from southwestern China to northeastern India and across the highlands of Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Even today, this immense region is home to more than 100 million people belonging to dozens of ethnic communities, including the Kachin, Wa, Yao, and many others. Scott argues that Zomia cannot simply be understood as a remote frontier. Instead, he presents it as a place where geography, history, and human choice combine to create societies fundamentally different from the powerful kingdoms that surrounded them. His first argument is rooted in geography. Mountains, dense forests, steep valleys, and scattered settlements made it extraordinarily difficult for pre-modern states to project authority into these regions. Armies struggled to move through rugged terrain, tax collectors found it nearly impossible to reach isolated villages, and centralized governments faced enormous logistical obstacles. While fertile plains encouraged large kingdoms and bureaucracies, the mountains naturally resisted political control. His second argument looks to history. According to Scott, many of the people living in these uplands were not isolated tribes that had always lived there. Rather, they were descendants of generations of refugees who fled expanding lowland kingdoms. As states became more powerful, demanding taxes, military service, forced labor, and obedience, many communities escaped into the mountains where government influence was far weaker. His third and perhaps most controversial claim goes even further. Scott suggests that many upland societies deliberately organize themselves in ways that discourage the emergence of centralized authority. Their social structures emphasized equality instead of hierarchy. Leadership remained temporary or limited, communities stayed relatively small, and institutions that could eventually develop into powerful states were intentionally avoided. One of Scott's most fascinating examples concerns literacy itself. Rather than viewing these societies as people who had never developed writing, he argues that some communities may actually have abandoned written language over time. In this interpretation, giving up writing was not a sign of backwardness, but a practical strategy. Literacy often supports bureaucracy, taxation, legal systems, and permanent social classes. Without it, building an administrative state becomes far more difficult. Naturally, these ideas have generated significant debate among historians and anthropologists. Critics question whether the inhabitants of Zomia were truly refugees from lowland states, pointing out that the historical evidence remains incomplete. Others argue that Scott places too much emphasis on geography, risking the suggestion that mountains automatically produce certain kinds of societies. Still, others challenge the idea that entire communities consciously chose to abandon writing or other complex institutions, arguing that such decisions would have required an extraordinary level of collective coordination. Despite these criticisms, Scott's work remains influential for another reason. Even if every historical detail cannot be proven, his interpretation offers a powerful way of thinking about societies that do not fit traditional narratives of progress. Instead of measuring every civilization by urban growth, expanding states, and increasingly complex economies, Scott encourages us to ask a different question. Perhaps some communities were not trying to build powerful kingdoms at all. This perspective becomes surprisingly useful when examining another mountainous region thousands of miles away, ancient Phrygia in central Anatolia. At first glance, Roman Phrygia appears to be an economic disappointment. Historians often describe the region as underdeveloped, fragmented, and resistant to urbanization. Yet, this was not always the case. During the early Iron Age, roughly between the 10th and 6th centuries BC, the Phrygian kingdom developed impressive settlements, specialized craftsmanship, expanding production, and a recognizable political structure. Then, everything changed. The centralized kingdom gradually disappeared. Large urban centers declined, political authority fragmented, and many areas returned to smaller agricultural and pastoral communities. Instead of densely populated cities connected through strong institutions, much of inland Anatolia became a landscape of scattered villages and local networks. Later conquests brought new rulers to the region. Greek and Macedonian settlers established colonies, and eventually the Roman Empire incorporated Phrygia into one of the greatest imperial systems the ancient world had ever known. Yet even under Roman rule, the transformation remained surprisingly limited. Cities existed, civic institutions appeared, and Roman administration reached the region, but much of the countryside continued to operate according to older local traditions. Beneath the thin veneer of urban life, society remained decentralized, rural, and only loosely connected to the structures of imperial government. Many scholars have interpreted this long history as evidence of failure. Why, they ask, did Phrygia never become as prosperous or as economically dynamic as other parts of the Roman world? Why did markets remain limited? Why did large-scale urbanization fail to reshape the countryside? Scott's ideas suggest another possibility. Instead of seeing Phrygia as a region that failed to develop, perhaps it should be understood as a society that followed a different path. Economic expansion, centralized bureaucracy, and increasingly complex political institutions are not the only measures of historical success. Communities often value stability, local autonomy, social equality, or cultural continuity more than constant growth. From this perspective, the apparent simplicity of inland Anatolia may not represent decline at all. It may instead reflect generations of people maintaining ways of life that suited their own priorities rather than those imposed by expanding states. Whether or not Scott's interpretation fully explains Phrygia is ultimately open to debate. Yet his ideas encourage us to reconsider one of history's most common assumptions: that every society naturally strives toward larger states, bigger cities, and more complex economies. Perhaps some societies did not fail to become powerful states. Perhaps they simply never wanted to. Imagine leaving the bustling streets of Constantinople behind and setting out toward the mysterious heart of Anatolia. The journey begins by crossing the Sea of Marmara to the city of Nicomedia before heading inland along the valley of the Sangarius River. At first, the landscape feels familiar. Forests cover the hillsides, fertile valleys support villages and orchards, and the climate is gentle enough for olives, mulberry trees, and silk production. But this comfortable world does not last for long. As the road climbs steadily beyond modern Bilecik and Soyut, everything begins to change. The valleys narrow into rocky gorges, the elevation rises rapidly, and the lush greenery slowly gives way to a harsher landscape. Crossing the wooded ridges of the Boz Mountains, travelers suddenly emerge onto the immense Anatolian plateau. Before them stretches a vast open plain unlike anything they have seen before. Trees become increasingly scarce, shade almost disappears, and the horizon seems endless. Here, on the edge of this windswept steppe, the land of ancient Phrygia truly begins. The region surrounding Dorylaeon, today's Eskişehir, offered a dramatic contrast to the country left behind. Rainfall was limited, summers were dry and unforgiving, while winters could be bitterly cold. Farming was possible, but the environment demanded constant adaptation. Instead of relying heavily on wheat, many communities favored barley, which matured more quickly and survived drought more effectively. Large. Stretches of land were better suited to grazing animals than growing crops, making livestock an essential part of daily life. Nature itself shaped every aspect of survival. Across the upper Sangarius basin, settlements were separated by remarkable distances. Towns such as Amorion, Nicolea, Pessinus, and Germa governed enormous rural territories instead of densely populated urban districts. Villages remained scattered across the plains, connected by long roads that crossed open grasslands and rolling hills. Even local administrative centers exercised authority over lands extending for dozens of kilometers, illustrating just how thinly populated much of central Anatolia remained throughout antiquity. Near the eastern bend of the Sangarius stood one of the most famous cities of Iron Age Anatolia, Gordion. Once the royal capital of the Phrygian kingdom and forever associated with the legendary King Midas, Gordian symbolized an earlier era when central Anatolia possessed a far stronger political organization. Monumental buildings, royal tombs, and impressive fortifications testified to a society capable of coordinating labor, accumulating wealth, and exercising centralized authority. Yet by later centuries, the surrounding countryside had changed dramatically. The power once concentrated in Gordion gradually faded, leaving behind smaller rural communities spread across the plateau. South of Dorylaeon, another landscape emerged. The Turkmen Mountains formed a natural barrier separating the northern plains from the region historians call the Phrygian highlands. Unlike the open steppe, these uplands were covered with pine forests and remarkable white volcanic rock formations that gave the countryside a striking appearance. During the first millennium BC, this mountainous district contained important religious sanctuaries, as well as the famous settlement now known as Midas City. Midas City occupied an isolated but strategically significant position among the rocky highlands. Religious monuments carved directly into towering cliffs reflected the importance of sacred traditions within Phrygian society. However, despite its earlier significance, the settlement gradually lost its importance after the arrival of Alexander the Great and the Macedonian conquest of Asia. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, no comparable urban center replaced it. Instead, much of the surrounding land was reorganized into large private estates and imperial domains administered from towns outside the highlands. Rather than encouraging urban expansion, Roman administration often reinforced the countryside's overwhelmingly rural character. Continuing southward, travelers eventually reached the basin of the Arka River, dominated by the imposing volcanic fortress that rises above modern Afyonkarahisar. This region occupied one of the most strategic positions in central Anatolia. Major roads converged here, linking western Anatolia with the central plateau and the interior with the Mediterranean. It was no coincidence that one of the decisive battles fought after. Alexander the Great's death, the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, took place in this very landscape. Just northeast of Afyon lay another source of wealth, the marble quarries of Dokimaion. Their brilliant white stone became one of the Roman Empire's most prized building materials. Massive blocks extracted from these hills traveled hundreds of kilometers to decorate temples, public buildings, palaces, and monuments throughout the Mediterranean. Although much of inland Phrygia appeared economically modest, its natural resources connected the region to markets extending across the Roman world. From Afyon, several roads opened toward different parts of Phrygia. One route followed the foothills of the Sultan Mountains into Phrygia Paroreos, where modest towns stood along the boundary between fertile valleys and the great central steppe. Another road turned towards Synada, an important administrative center surrounded by mountain ranges. Yet another descended westward into greener valleys approaching Lydia, where rainfall increased and agriculture became far more productive than on the dry central plateau. Dominating western Phrygia stood Mount Dindymos, today known as Murat Dağ. Rising more than 2,000 meters above sea level, it served as one of Anatolia's great watersheds. Rivers flowing from its slopes nourished valleys extending in every direction, creating some of the richest agricultural districts in inland Western Asia Minor. Compared with the dry northern plains, these lower mountain slopes supported far more intensive cultivation and larger concentrations of population. North of the mountain stretched the Upper Tembris Valley. During the Roman period, this region remained overwhelmingly rural. Rather than growing into major cities, communities developed as prosperous villages surrounded by imperial and senatorial estates. Hundreds of elaborately carved funerary monuments still survive from these settlements, revealing that even without impressive cities, considerable local prosperity existed among village populations. Wealth here expressed itself through rural communities instead of urban centers. Immediately west lay a striking exception. The settlement of Izanoi developed into one of Roman Phrygia's few genuine cities, despite occupying land that was not especially rich in natural resources. Public buildings, temples, markets, and civic institutions transformed Izanoi into an important urban center, demonstrating that geography alone did not determine every aspect of regional development. Human decisions, Trade routes and political investment also played important roles in shaping local history. Further south, the fertile Banas Plain formed another important center of settlement. Here stood Achaemenea, one of central Phrygia's leading cities. Its strategic location allowed it to control the principal east-west road linking Sardis with the Anatolian interior. Merchants, soldiers, imperial officials, and travelers moving across Central Asia. Minor inevitably passed through this narrow corridor, making Achaemenea an important commercial and administrative hub despite its inland location. Beyond Achaemenea, towering mountain chains divided the wetter valleys of southwestern Phrygia from the dry plains farther east. The contrast was remarkable. On one side flourished orchards, gardens, and productive farmland supplied by reliable rivers. On the other stretched open landscapes where trees became rare and agriculture faced constant environmental challenges. Even today, this sharp ecological transition remains visible across western Turkey. Eventually, the journey reaches the valleys of the Meander and Lycus rivers, where the character of Phrygia changes once again. Here stood wealthy Roman cities such as Laodicea and Hierapolis, thriving centers of textile production closely connected to the prosperous Aegean world. These urban centers possessed little in common with the isolated villages of the Central Plateau. Their economies were integrated into long-distance trade networks, their populations were larger, and their cultural connections extended across the eastern Mediterranean. This extraordinary diversity explains why Phrygia can never be understood as a single, uniform landscape. It was a mosaic of mountains, forests, dry steppes, fertile valleys, scattered villages, prosperous estates, sacred highlands, marble quarries, crossroads, and flourishing cities. Geography continually shaped opportunities, but it never completely dictated history. The farther one traveled across Phrygia, the clearer one reality became. Every change in elevation transformed the environment, every valley supported a different way of life, and every mountain range created new cultural boundaries. Some districts encouraged urban growth and commercial exchange, while others remained decentralized, pastoral, and deeply rural for centuries. Understanding ancient Phrygia therefore requires more than studying kingdoms or emperors. It requires understanding the land itself, because throughout its long history, geography remained one of the most powerful forces shaping the lives of the people who called this remarkable region home. By the middle of the first millennium BC, Phrygia experienced one of the most remarkable transformations in the ancient world. Rather than steadily becoming more centralized and politically sophisticated, as many civilizations did, it moved in the opposite direction. A kingdom that had once displayed many of the characteristics of an organized state gradually dissolved, leaving behind a society that was smaller, less urbanized, and far less dependent on centralized authority. During the 9th through the 6th centuries BC, Phrygia stood among the most advanced societies of inland Anatolia. Powerful rulers governed extensive territories, monumental architecture dominated important settlements, writing was widely used, and specialized craftsmen produced goods on a large scale. Royal courts, administrative centers, and religious sanctuaries reflected a society with clear social hierarchies and impressive organizational capabilities. Famous rulers, including the legendary King Midas, belonged to this period of Phrygian power when the kingdom exercised influence across much of central and western Anatolia. Yet, within only a few centuries, this political landscape had almost completely disappeared. By the late 4th century BC, centralized authority had largely vanished. The great palaces no longer functioned, monumental construction had almost ceased, and urban life had declined dramatically. Writing, once an important feature of Phrygian society, became increasingly rare. For generations, inscriptions almost disappeared from the region, only slowly returning during the final centuries before the Roman Empire and becoming common much later than in most other parts of the Mediterranean. The contrast between these two periods is so striking that historians continue to debate how such a dramatic reversal could have occurred. The clearest evidence for Phrygia's earlier prosperity comes from Gordion, the kingdom's political and ceremonial center. Archaeological excavations reveal that between the 10th and 9th centuries BC, the city underwent an extraordinary wave of construction. At the heart of the settlement rose a massive citadel where impressive ceremonial courtyards were surrounded by enormous megaron buildings. These large halls probably served several purposes at once. They hosted official ceremonies, received distinguished guests, and likely functioned as important religious spaces. Monumental gateways and carefully planned approaches emphasized the authority of those who ruled from this elevated complex. Immediately beside these ceremonial buildings stood an enormous industrial quarter that demonstrates just how sophisticated the Phrygian economy had already become. Two exceptionally long structures faced each other across a broad avenue. Each building was divided into numerous individual working units where hundreds of laborers carried out organized production under centralized supervision. These workshops were unlike anything else known from the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. Archaeologists have identified well over 100 weaving looms, revealing an industrial-scale textile operation capable of producing enormous quantities of cloth. Nearby ovens, grain storage facilities, and food preparation areas indicate that this workforce was supplied through a carefully coordinated administrative system. The complex was not simply a collection of independent craftsmen. It represented a highly organized production center where labor, resources, and distribution were all managed from above. The relationship between the workshops and the neighboring palace reveals a society with pronounced social divisions. While ordinary workers produced textiles and prepared food, political and religious elites occupied monumental residences, overlooking the complex. Economic production and political authority were physically connected, reflecting a kingdom capable of directing labor on a remarkable scale. Around the beginning of the 8th century BC, disaster struck when a devastating fire destroyed much of Gordion's monumental center. Rather than abandoning the city, however, the Phrygians rebuilt it almost immediately. New palaces rose on the ruins of the old ones, preserving many elements of the earlier design while expanding the settlement even further. Additional elite residences appeared elsewhere on the citadel, suggesting that the ruling class itself had grown larger and more influential. As Phrygian influence expanded across Anatolia, similar monumental architecture appeared in other important settlements. Along the southern coast of the Sea of Marmara, the city of Dascalion developed an impressive palace complex reflecting the same traditions visible at Gordion. Far to the east, at the vast fortified city of Kirkenes-Dar, another monumental palace dominated the landscape behind massive defensive walls. Visitors approaching the city entered through carefully designed gateways decorated with elaborate stone sculpture, emphasizing both royal authority and architectural ambition. These impressive buildings demonstrate that centralized political power was not confined to a single capital. Instead, a network of elite centers stretched across much of Phrygia, each displaying similar expressions of wealth, administration, and royal prestige. Monumental construction required thousands of workers, skilled craftsmen, abundant resources, and leaders capable of organizing large populations toward common goals. The Phrygian highlands provide further evidence of this growing concentration of power. During the first half of the 6th century BC, local elites commissioned spectacular monuments carved directly into towering rock faces. The most famous example is the enormous Midas monument near Yazilikaya. Rising dramatically from the surrounding cliffs, its geometric facade represents one of the masterpieces of Iron Age Anatolian architecture. The Midas monument did not stand alone. Similar rock-cut facades appeared throughout the highlands, particularly around the valleys north of Afyon and near Kutaya. Some overlooked important settlements, while others dominated isolated landscapes that likely held deep religious significance. Whatever their exact purpose, all required extraordinary planning, engineering skill, and organized labor. These monuments could only have been created by rulers who possessed both considerable wealth and the authority to mobilize large numbers of workers over extended periods. Taken together, the archaeological evidence paints a picture of an increasingly complex kingdom. Monumental palaces, industrial workshops, elite residences, ceremonial gateways, fortified cities, and gigantic rock-cut sanctuaries all point toward a society. with powerful hereditary rulers, sophisticated administration, specialized production, and substantial economic resources. This makes what happened next even more remarkable. Within only a few generations, much of this elaborate political system simply disappeared. The great palaces fell silent, large construction projects ceased, and centralized institutions gradually dissolved. Instead of expanding into an even stronger kingdom, Phrygia fragmented into smaller rural communities scattered across the Anatolian plateau. Monumental architecture became increasingly rare, literacy declined dramatically, and local villages replaced the administrative centers that had once dominated the landscape. For historians, this transformation remains one of ancient Anatolia's greatest mysteries. Most civilizations of the ancient Near East followed a familiar pattern, moving gradually toward larger cities, stronger governments, and increasingly complex economies. Phrygia appears to have traveled in precisely the opposite direction. Rather than becoming more centralized, it became more decentralized. Rather than increasing social hierarchy, local communities seem to have become less dependent upon powerful political institutions. Understanding why this remarkable transformation occurred is essential for understanding Phrygia itself. It forces us to reconsider the common assumption that every ancient society naturally evolved toward greater urbanization and stronger states. In the case of Phrygia, history followed a very different path, leaving behind one of the ancient world's most unusual examples of political and social change. The glory of Iron Age Phrygia did not disappear overnight, but beginning in the mid-6th century BC, its character changed in ways that few other ancient societies experienced. Instead of becoming larger, wealthier, and more centralized, Phrygia gradually moved in the opposite direction. Monumental architecture became increasingly rare, political elites faded from view, and the institutions that had once organized production and society slowly dissolved. Rather than marking the rise of a stronger kingdom, this period witnessed the quiet retreat of the state itself. One of the earliest signs of this transformation can be seen in the fate of the great Phrygian monuments. The enormous fortified city of Kirkenes was violently destroyed around the time the Persian Empire expanded into central Anatolia, after which it was never reoccupied. At Midas City, several monumental rock-cut projects were abandoned while still under construction. Huge facades that had required years of planning and immense amounts of labor suddenly stopped halfway through. Some later monuments continued to be carved during the following centuries, but they were noticeably smaller and far less ambitious than those created during the kingdom's golden age. The same trend appeared at Gordion, once the political and ceremonial heart of Phrygia. For centuries, the city had been dominated by impressive palaces, administrative buildings, and monumental tombs built for powerful rulers. After the Persian conquest, however, these projects simply ceased. No grand palaces replaced the earlier complexes, and the enormous burial mounds that had once celebrated elite families were no longer constructed. Instead, sections of the citadel that had previously housed royal institutions gradually filled with modest workshops, small-scale industries, and ordinary domestic buildings. The contrast with the earlier royal center could hardly have been greater. Archaeological surveys also reveal that the countryside changed alongside the cities. During the Middle Phrygian period, agriculture had become increasingly intensive, supporting relatively dense rural populations. In the centuries that followed, many settlements declined or disappeared altogether. Farming shifted away from intensive cultivation toward more extensive livestock grazing across the open steppe. Rather than concentrating labor and production under centralized supervision, communities increasingly relied on smaller, more independent household economies. Curiously, this transformation did not necessarily mean that Gordion itself entered a period of economic collapse. Archaeological discoveries show that imported Greek pottery and transport amphorae actually became more common during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, suggesting that trade with the wider Mediterranean remained active or even increased. The city continued to participate in regional exchange networks, but its internal organization had fundamentally changed. Political power became less concentrated, elite families disappeared, the palace lost its central role, and many activities that had once been managed by royal institutions returned to individual households and private workshops. Writing followed an almost identical trajectory. The earliest Phrygian inscriptions appeared during the late 9th or early 8th century BC, precisely when the kingdom itself was emerging as a major regional power. Over the following centuries, inscriptions multiplied across monuments, sanctuaries, pottery, and public buildings. Written language became an important part of political authority, religion, and everyday administration. Yet after the 6th century BC, this flourishing literary tradition rapidly declined. Monumental inscriptions virtually disappeared, surviving examples became limited mostly to short graffiti, and by the late 5th or early 4th century BC, written Phrygian had almost vanished altogether. Following Alexander the Great's conquest, the language essentially disappeared from written records for centuries. Only during the Roman imperial period did Phrygian once again appear regularly in inscriptions, making it one of the latest regional languages in Asia Minor to return to public written use. This decline began well before Greek cultural influence became dominant, suggesting that the disappearance of writing reflected internal developments within Phrygian society rather than simple cultural replacement. For many years, historians explained these changes as the inevitable consequence of the Persian conquest. Certainly, Persian armies destroyed important centers such as Kirkenes, and archaeological evidence confirms episodes of warfare and destruction throughout the region. At first glance, it seems natural to conclude that foreign invasion shattered the Phrygian state. Yet this explanation quickly encounters serious problems. Persian expansion affected nearly every civilization across Western Asia and the Near East. Lydia, Babylonia, Egypt, and the Greek cities of Asia Minor all came under Persian rule, often after violent military campaigns. Nevertheless, these societies generally retained their political elites, monumental architecture, and local traditions. Sardis, the Lydian capital, recovered rapidly after its conquest. Wealthy families continued constructing enormous burial mounds, while local aristocrats maintained their influence throughout Persian rule. In Lycia, the Persian period actually witnessed increasing political centralization, stronger local dynasties, elaborate tombs, and the growth of fortified cities. Only Phrygia followed a dramatically different path. Here, elite families gradually disappeared, monumental construction nearly ceased, and centralized political institutions faded away instead of adapting to Persian administration. This unusual pattern suggests that something more complex than military conquest alone was taking place. One increasingly influential interpretation views this transformation not as simple collapse, but as a practical response to imperial rule. The Persian Empire depended heavily upon collecting taxes and tribute from conquered territories. Rather than governing every village directly, Persian authorities usually relied upon existing local governments to gather surplus agricultural production and forward it to imperial administrators. Regions possessing strong centralized institutions therefore became particularly valuable because efficient local rulers made taxation relatively easy. If this model is correct, dismantling centralized institutions could actually reduce the effectiveness of imperial taxation. As Phrygia became less hierarchical, its population increasingly lived in dispersed villages and relatively independent farming communities. Without large administrative centers, powerful aristocracies, or centralized storage facilities, collecting taxes across the vast Anatolian plateau became considerably more difficult. Persian officials would have needed to travel enormous distances simply to collect relatively small surpluses from thousands of scattered households. In practical terms, the effort may not have justified the reward. Viewed from this perspective, Phrygia's apparent decline begins to look remarkably different. Instead of representing institutional failure, political decentralization may have become an effective strategy for limiting outside control. Large palaces, centralized workshops, monumental construction, and concentrated agricultural production had once strengthened the kingdom. But under Persian domination, those same institutions could also have made taxation far easier. Smaller villages, local autonomy, and dispersed production offered fewer opportunities for imperial authorities to extract wealth. This interpretation cannot be proven with absolute certainty, but but it offers an intriguing alternative to the traditional narrative of decline. Rather than describing a society that simply failed, it suggests one that gradually reorganized itself under new political realities. The state did not necessarily collapse because its people lacked the ability to maintain it. Instead, many of the advantages once provided by centralized government may no longer have outweighed the costs imposed by imperial rule. Such a transformation naturally carried significant disadvantages. Without strong political institutions, Phrygia became increasingly vulnerable to slave raiding and external threats. Rural communities possessed fewer collective means of defending themselves against organized military powers. Yet, decentralization also brought important benefits. Local villages enjoyed greater autonomy, social hierarchies became less pronounced, and ordinary people lived with far less interference from distant political authorities. For many inhabitants, daily life may actually have become freer despite living inside one of history's largest empires. A farmer on the Anatolian plateau still recognized Persian sovereignty, yet the practical reach of imperial administration into his village remained limited. Instead of supporting a powerful local aristocracy or maintaining an expensive royal bureaucracy, many communities governed themselves through local customs and household economies. Seen through this lens, the history of late Phrygia challenges one of the oldest assumptions in world history: that civilization always advances toward larger governments, stronger states, and greater political centralization. Phrygia followed another path. Whether by deliberate choice, gradual adaptation, or historical necessity, its people increasingly turned away from the institutions that had once defined their kingdom. In doing so, they created a society that valued local independence over centralized authority, a remarkable political experiment whose legacy continued well into the Roman era. Long before Alexander the Great marched into Asia, the people of Phrygia had already established strong commercial ties with the Greek communities that lined the Aegean coast. For centuries, merchants carried Phrygian bronze objects, finely woven textiles, and other valuable goods westward, while Greek pottery and luxury products steadily found their way into the Anatolian interior. These exchanges created regular contact between two very different cultures, yet trade alone did not erase their differences. The most important meeting ground between Greeks and Phrygians was the lower valleys of the Rhindakos and Sangarios rivers in northwestern Anatolia. Here, mountain routes descending from the central plateau met the fertile coastal plains bordering the Sea of Marmara. For generations, traders, travelers, and pilgrims passed through these valleys, transforming them into natural crossroads where ideas, customs, and religious traditions could circulate alongside commercial goods. One remarkable discovery illustrates this relationship particularly well. Near modern Vizierhan, archaeologists uncovered a bilingual sacred inscription written in both Greek and Phrygian. Rather than separating the two communities, the inscription suggests that Greek and Phrygian-speaking worshippers visited the same rural sanctuary during the late 5th century BC. Although each group preserved its own language, they shared at least some religious practices and sacred spaces. This was not merely a commercial frontier, but also a place where different cultures interacted peacefully in everyday life. The location itself explains why such exchanges occurred. Vizierhan stood beside the narrow Karasu Valley, the principal route connecting the Phrygian heartland around Dorylaeon with the prosperous Greek cities surrounding Nicomedia and Nicaea. Anyone traveling between the Anatolian plateau and the Sea of Marmara naturally passed through this corridor. Over centuries, the valley became one of the most important cultural bridges linking inland Anatolia with the Greek world. Despite these long-standing contacts, however, the Phrygians had not become Greek by the end of the 4th century BC. Historical evidence makes this distinction surprisingly clear. An inscription discovered at Zelaya shortly after Alexander's conquest carefully distinguishes between the Greek citizens living inside the town and the Phrygian farmers occupying the surrounding countryside. These rural Phrygians cultivated public land and paid taxes, yet they remained legally and ethnically separate from the Greek urban population. This separation is particularly striking because Greeks and Phrygians had lived beside one another in northwestern Anatolia for more than 3 centuries. Even after generations of coexistence, they continued to preserve distinct identities, languages, and social traditions. Unlike neighboring peoples such as the Lydians, Carians, and Lycians, who increasingly adopted Greek names, public inscriptions, and aspects of Greek political culture, the Phrygians remained remarkably resistant to cultural assimilation. Their society retained its own identity long after many surrounding regions had embraced elements of Hellenic civilization. The true transformation began only after Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire in the 330s BC. His conquest did far more than replace one imperial ruler with another. It initiated a massive wave of Greek and Macedonian settlement across inland Anatolia, introducing entirely new populations into regions that had previously remained overwhelmingly Phrygian. Veterans of Alexander's armies, together with later settlers serving the Hellenistic kingdoms, established colonies throughout southern and central Phrygia. New Greek cities appeared across the landscape, including Dokimaion, founded by the Macedonian officer Dokimos, along with numerous other settlements established under Seleucid and Attalid rule. Places such as Philomelion, Toriaion, Apamea, Blondos, Antiochia, Apollonia, Eumenea, Isanoi, Akmonea, and Dorylion gradually became centers from which Greek language, architecture, administration, and civic traditions spread into the surrounding countryside. Unlike earlier centuries, when Greek influence arrived primarily through trade, these new settlements permanently altered the demographic landscape. Colonists brought not only their language but also their political institutions, religious customs, artistic traditions, and patterns of urban life. For the first time, substantial Greek-speaking communities became permanent neighbors of the native Phrygian population. Evidence from the regions surrounding Dokimaion offers a fascinating glimpse into this first generation of settlers. One funerary inscription commemorates Philippos, a Macedonian veteran originating from Elimiotis. Another belongs to Demetria, a woman from the Thessalian city of Larissa who had settled in Phrygia during the early Hellenistic period. What makes Demetria's monument particularly revealing is not its inscription, but the stone itself. Rather than commissioning an entirely new monument, her family appears to have reused an older Phrygian funerary stele dating back to the Persian period. Although the original Phrygian owners had long abandoned this style of monument, the newly arrived Greek settlers found no hesitation in adapting older local materials for their own purposes. It was a practical decision, but it also symbolized the beginning of a gradual blending of traditions. Even more remarkable are two neighboring tombstones discovered near Dokimaion. The first commemorates a man named Nicostratos through an inscription written in the Phrygian language. Yet there is an important difference. Instead of using the ancient Phrygian alphabet, which had largely disappeared generations earlier, the text was carved entirely with Greek letters. Beside it stood another monument dedicated to Nicostratos' daughter, Tatis, whose inscription was written in Greek. Together, these monuments reveal a family standing between two worlds. The men bore unmistakably Greek names such as Nicostratos, Kleomachos, and Theophilos, while the daughter carried what appears to have been a traditional local Phrygian name. Their choice of alphabet was Greek, yet one monument still preserved the Phrygian language itself. This extraordinary combination illustrates how cultural change rarely occurs through simple replacement. Rather than one civilization completely absorbing another, the earliest generations of Hellenistic Phrygia produced hybrid communities in which Greek and native traditions coexisted within the same families. Some individuals adopted Greek names while continuing to speak Phrygian. Others embraced Greek writing while preserving older local customs. Intermarriage, shared communities, and daily interaction blurred cultural boundaries that had once appeared much more rigid. The city of Gordion presents a different picture of this process. Unlike many southern settlements, Gordion was never transformed into a major Greek colonial city. Instead, its Phrygian inhabitants gradually adopted selected aspects of Hellenistic material culture on their own. Greek pottery, imported amphorae, and luxury goods became increasingly common, reflecting participation in wider Mediterranean trade without requiring large-scale foreign settlement. Archaeologists divide Hellenistic Gordion into several distinct phases based largely upon the quantity of imported Greek goods. During the decades immediately following Alexander's conquest, imported ceramics continued arriving in substantial numbers. This flow was interrupted during the early 3rd century BC, when the Galatian invasions disrupted overland trade routes across Anatolia. Only later did imported products begin to return, though never in the same abundance as before. Eventually, around 189 BC, Gordion itself was abandoned as an urban center. For decades, the once great capital that had ruled much of central Anatolia stood largely deserted before later communities eventually returned centuries afterward. The decline of Gordion marked the end of a city whose history stretched back hundreds of years, and whose royal courts had once symbolized the power of the Phrygian kingdom. The story of Hellenistic Phrygia is therefore not one of immediate conquest or complete cultural replacement. Instead, it was a gradual process shaped by trade, migration, adaptation, and coexistence. Greek merchants had visited Phrygia for centuries before Alexander arrived, yet the Phrygians maintained a remarkably distinct identity. Only with the establishment of permanent Greek and Macedonian settlements did cultural boundaries begin to soften. Even then, change remained uneven. Some cities quickly adopted Greek institutions, while others preserved older traditions. Some families embraced Greek language, yet retained Phrygian customs. Others combined Greek names with native identities, or revived an ancient language using a completely different alphabet. Rather than disappearing overnight, Phrygian culture slowly blended with the expanding Hellenistic world, producing a society that belonged fully to neither tradition, but instead reflected centuries of interaction between two remarkable civilizations. By the Hellenistic period, Phrygia had entered a new chapter in its history. The powerful kingdom that had once dominated central Anatolia no longer existed, yet its people had not disappeared. Instead, they found themselves living in a rapidly changing world shaped by the expansion of Greek culture, Macedonian military power, and new colonial settlements established across the Anatolian plateau. The transformation that followed was gradual rather than sudden. Greek customs spread through some regions with remarkable speed, while other parts of Phrygia preserved older traditions for generations. Gordion provides one of the clearest examples of this changing society. Although the city had lost the monumental palaces and centralized institutions that once defined its political importance, it did not become an impoverished ruin. Instead, it developed into a modest rural community where daily life revolved around farming, animal husbandry, and household production. The houses of Hellenistic Gordion reflected this simpler way of life. Rather than imposing stone palaces or elaborate public buildings, most families lived in small, mud brick homes covered with thatched roofs. Monumental architecture had virtually disappeared. Even the few impressive burial mounds dating from this period probably belonged not to the native Phrygians, but to Galatian nobles who had settled nearby after migrating into Anatolia. Craft production was equally modest. Pottery was generally produced within individual households instead of specialized workshops. Only during the later Hellenistic period do archaeologists detect the appearance of two professional pottery workshops, the first evidence of specialized ceramic production at Gordion for several centuries. The overwhelming majority of the population appears to have remained directly engaged in agriculture or livestock raising rather than urban crafts or large-scale manufacturing. Regional archaeological surveys reinforce this picture. Small rural settlements were scattered across the countryside, separated by considerable distances. Instead of concentrated farming, supported by large administrative centers, the landscape became dominated by extensive grazing and pastoral life. This pattern, which had already begun during the late Phrygian period, continued throughout the Hellenistic age, producing a countryside filled with independent farms rather than densely populated villages. Yet, while Phrygia's economy remained relatively simple, its cultural life was changing rapidly. The decades following Alexander's conquest brought an increasing fascination with Greek customs. Archaeologists have uncovered houses equipped with distinctly Greek features, including ceramic bathtubs and new styles of cooking vessels previously unknown in the region. Everyday life gradually absorbed objects that reflected Mediterranean tastes and habits. Writing changed just as dramatically. The old Phrygian alphabet had completely vanished, replaced by Greek. Over the century and a half following Alexander's conquest, dozens of short Greek inscriptions and graffiti appeared throughout Gordion. Personal names changed as well. Traditional Greek names, such as Demophanes, Menecrates, and Satyros, became increasingly common, while older Phrygian names survived only occasionally. Particularly revealing are individuals named after heroes from Homer's epics, including Achilles, Hector, and Antenor. Such names suggest that local families were actively embracing Greek cultural identity rather than merely living alongside it. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this transformation comes not from a city, but from two villages in the lower Lycus Valley. A remarkable inscription dating to 267 BC records a formal decree issued jointly by the communities of Neontikos and Kidiokome. During a difficult period marked by Galatian invasions, local officials had secured the release of villagers taken hostage, and the communities decided to honor these benefactors publicly. At first glance, the inscription resembles countless civic decrees from the Greek world. It describes a public assembly, votes of gratitude, religious ceremonies, annual festivals, and the erection of an inscribed stone monument. Local sanctuaries are identified with Greek gods such as Zeus and Apollo, while the decree itself is written in fluent Koine Greek. What makes this document extraordinary is its location. These were not long-established Greek cities, but rural communities in the heart of Phrygia. Within only a few generations after Alexander's conquest, villagers who had once belonged to a distinctly Phrygian cultural world were now expressing public life through Greek language, Greek political institutions, and Greek religious terminology. The transformation was remarkably deep, especially in southwestern Phrygia, where nearby Seleucid colonies accelerated the spread of Hellenistic culture. Later inscriptions from Laodicea demonstrate just how complete this process eventually became. Lists of local citizens reveal overwhelmingly Greek and Macedonian personal names, with only a handful preserving any obvious local origin. By the Roman imperial period, the lower Lycus Valley had become virtually indistinguishable from the thoroughly Hellenized regions of Western Asia Minor. Northern Phrygia, however, followed a rather different course. Here, the spread of Greek culture proceeded much more slowly. The once important settlement of Midas City was abandoned around the time of Alexander's conquest, leaving behind little evidence for continued occupation. Elsewhere, archaeological remains are sparse, making it far more difficult to reconstruct everyday life. One exception is Aizanoi. Long before the arrival of Greek settlers, this site had already possessed an important sanctuary dedicated to Zeus, although its earliest history remains poorly understood. During the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, however, the rulers of Pergamon and neighboring Bithynia dramatically reshaped the area by granting extensive estates to the sanctuary. These lands were then divided among Macedonian military settlers, creating a new colonial community intended to secure this strategically important frontier. The earliest surviving private inscription from Aizanoi belongs to two brothers bearing unmistakably Macedonian names, suggesting that at least part of the new population consisted of military colonists settled directly by the Hellenistic kings. Archaeology reveals that these settlers enjoyed a very different standard of living from the native population. One excavated residence near the sanctuary was an elegant Greek-style house decorated with imitation marble plaster, fine imported pottery from Pergamon, and dozens of ceilings used in official administration. Its owner was almost certainly a wealthy Greek or Macedonian colonist. Across the river, however, archaeologists uncovered an entirely different neighborhood. Here stood small, simply constructed houses, lacking the luxury found in the colonial quarter. The contrast strongly suggests that two distinct communities coexisted within the same settlement. On one side lived prosperous Greek and Macedonian landholders who had received estates from Hellenistic rulers. On the other remained the indigenous Phrygian population, continuing a much more modest rural existence. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere across central Phrygia. Excavations at Seitoma reveal another heavily fortified settlement that was probably founded as a Macedonian military colony. Even centuries later, traces of these colonial communities survived. During the Roman imperial period, prominent families at Eucarpia continued using titles that almost certainly originated within earlier Hellenistic military settlements. At Achaemenea, one distinguished citizen proudly described himself as Macedonian, demonstrating that the prestige attached to colonial ancestry remained socially important long after Roman rule had replaced the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Hellenization of Phrygia was therefore far more complex than a simple replacement of one culture by another. Some regions embraced Greek institutions with remarkable speed, while others changed only gradually. Greek cities, military colonies, and royal foundations introduced new languages, political systems, and social hierarchies, yet native communities continued to shape the character of the countryside. By the beginning of the Roman era, much of southern and western Phrygia had become deeply integrated into the Greek-speaking world. Public inscriptions, personal names, civic assemblies, and religious life all reflected Hellenistic influence. Nevertheless, beneath this cultural transformation remained a landscape still marked by its Phrygian past, a countryside of scattered villages, independent farmers, and communities whose social traditions had been shaped by centuries of life beyond the reach of powerful centralized states. Rather than erasing Phrygia's identity, the Hellenistic age layered new cultural influences upon an older foundation, creating one of the most distinctive frontier societies in the ancient Mediterranean. The beginning of the 1st century BC marked a decisive turning point in the history of Phrygia. During the 2 centuries that followed Alexander the Great's conquest, Greek influence had spread across central Anatolia only gradually. Some regions embraced Hellenistic customs quickly, while others remained deeply rooted in older Phrygian traditions. Greek colonies introduced new political institutions, language, and culture, yet their impact varied greatly from one district to another. Then, within only a few decades, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. Between roughly 150 BC, communities throughout Phrygia began redefining themselves in entirely new ways. Large cities with predominantly Greek populations recently founded colonial settlements, and even small rural villages started adopting the institutions, language, and public identity traditionally associated with the Greek polis. What had once been a slow process of cultural exchange suddenly became a widespread political transformation. Aizanoi provides one of the clearest examples of this remarkable shift. During the late 2nd century BC, the settlement did not yet function as an independent city-state. Instead, it belonged to a broader regional federation known as the Epicteteis, a name meaning the newly added territories. This association probably originated under the Attalid kingdom after northern Phrygia was incorporated into Pergamene rule during the 3rd century BC. The federation included several settlements scattered across northern Phrygia, among them Kadoi, Kotiaion, Nakolea, Dorylaion, Medaion, and Aizanoi itself. Although little is known about its internal organization, archaeological and numismatic evidence suggests that these communities cooperated politically while maintaining a shared regional identity. They even produced their own bronze coinage and occasionally acted together in diplomatic affairs, including honoring Roman officials who had assisted them during the wars against Mithridates. Everything changed by the middle of the 1st century BC. In 49 or 48 BC, the people of Aizanoi erected an elaborate honorary inscription for an elderly citizen named Monogenes. At first glance, the document appears entirely ordinary by Greek standards. It records a formal decision of the city council, praises Monogenes for his honesty and public service, awards him a golden crown after his death, and orders a ceremonial funeral procession through the marketplace before his burial. Yet the inscription reveals something far more significant than the honors granted to one respected citizen. For the first time, Aizanoi presents itself as a fully developed Greek-style city. The decree refers to a council, elected magistrates, organized civic institutions, public assemblies, and age groups such as the ephebes and young citizens, all characteristic features of Hellenistic urban government. Reading the inscription alone, one might easily imagine that Aizanoi had functioned as a Greek polis for centuries. In reality, this civic identity had emerged only recently, perhaps even during Monogenes' own lifetime. The importance of this document extends far beyond Aizanoi itself. It represents one of the earliest surviving civic decrees from northern Phrygia and suggests that neighboring settlements underwent similar transformations at approximately the same time. Communities that had previously belonged to loose regional associations increasingly reorganized themselves as independent cities, possessing their own political institutions, magistrates, assemblies, and civic identities. This pattern was not confined to northern Phrygia alone. Across inland Anatolia, inscriptions dating to the early 1st century BC suddenly begin mentioning city councils, public decrees, gymnasia, magistrates, and other institutions familiar throughout the Greek world. Synada honored distinguished citizens through formal public decrees. Dokimeion produced its earliest civic inscriptions. Themisonion commemorated local officials responsible for education and public administration. Apollonia erected honorary monuments celebrating members of its local elite, while communities throughout Western Phrygia began issuing similar official documents for the first time. Within the span of a single generation, dozens of settlements adopted remarkably similar forms of public government and civic self-representation. Another equally visible sign of this transformation appeared in the production of coinage. For centuries, Phrygia had produced remarkably little local currency. Before the 2nd century BC, virtually no Phrygian communities minted coins in their own names. A few major centers later struck silver cistophoric coins under Attalid administration, but local bronze currency remained exceptionally rare. Then, during the 1st century BC, the situation changed almost overnight. Around 20 Phrygian communities began producing regular issues of bronze and brass coinage bearing their own civic identities, cities that had never previously issued. Money suddenly developed local mints. The largest and most active mint operated at Apamea, where dozens of different magistrates supervised successive coin issues beginning around 89 or 88 BC. Other towns quickly followed, creating a monetary landscape unlike anything previously seen in inland Anatolia. The appearance of these local coins carried significance far beyond economics. Throughout the Hellenistic world, the right to strike coinage served as a powerful expression of civic identity. Coins displayed the names of cities, local magistrates, religious symbols, and political authority. By minting their own currency, Phrygian communities publicly declared themselves participants in the wider civic culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. Taken together, the evidence reveals a profound transformation occurring during the first half of the 1st century BC. Communities that had once existed as loosely organized villages, military colonies, or regional federations increasingly began presenting themselves as autonomous Greek-style cities. Public inscriptions multiplied, councils and magistrates became visible in the historical record, honorary decrees celebrated distinguished citizens, and local coinage proclaimed newly established civic identities. This transformation did not necessarily mean that every aspect of daily life suddenly became Greek. Much of the countryside remained overwhelmingly rural, and older Phrygian traditions undoubtedly survived within families, villages, and local religious practices. Nevertheless, the language through which communities expressed political authority had fundamentally changed. Public life increasingly operated through institutions modeled on the Greek polis, creating a common political vocabulary that stretched across much of Western Asia Minor. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Phrygia had entered a new phase of its history. The decentralized society that had emerged after the collapse of the old Phrygian kingdom was gradually giving way to a landscape filled with self-governing cities, civic assemblies, public magistrates, and local coinage. Rather than erasing Phrygia's past, this transformation overlaid older rural traditions with a new civic framework, preparing the region for its eventual integration into the Roman provincial system. In many respects, it was during this brief but decisive period that the foundations of Roman Phrygia were finally laid. The middle of the 1st century BC brought another profound transformation to Phrygia. Earlier generations had witnessed the gradual spread of Greek culture through trade, migration, and the establishment of Hellenistic colonies. Now, a new power began reshaping the region even more dramatically. As Roman authority expanded across Western Asia Minor, the political identity of Phrygian communities evolved once again, producing changes that reached far beyond language or architecture. One of the clearest signs of this transformation was the sudden appearance of public inscriptions and local coinage across the region. Throughout the 1st century BC, communities that had rarely left written public records suddenly began carving official decrees onto stone and striking bronze coins bearing their own names. At first glance, this might seem like another stage in the long process of Hellenization, since both practices had deep roots in the Greek cities of the Aegean world, yet the timing raises an important question. Greek influence had existed in Phrygia for centuries. Greek merchants had traded there since the Iron Age, Macedonian colonies had been established after Alexander's conquest, and Hellenistic kingdoms had ruled much of the region for generations. If simple cultural imitation were responsible, why did this dramatic explosion of civic activity occur only during the 1st century BC rather than 2 centuries earlier? A comparison with neighboring Cappadocia makes the puzzle even more striking. Like Phrygia, Cappadocia had experienced gradual exposure to Greek culture throughout the Hellenistic age, yet Cappadocian communities rarely adopted the civic habits now spreading across Phrygia. Public inscriptions remained uncommon, independent police were relatively few, and local bronze coinage never became widespread. Clearly, something unique was happening within Phrygia itself. The answer may lie not in Greece, but in Rome. During the late 2nd century BC, Phrygia was incorporated into the Roman province of Asia. This administrative change fundamentally altered the region's relationship with the Mediterranean world. Roman governors arrived to supervise provincial affairs, while Italian merchants, financiers, tax collectors, and slave traders increasingly established permanent businesses throughout inland Anatolia. Unlike earlier Greek traders, these newcomers often settled permanently rather than simply passing through. Their commercial interests connected even remote Phrygian communities to expanding Roman economic networks. Markets grew larger, trade intensified, and local elites found themselves dealing directly with Roman businessmen whose influence extended throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The earliest inscriptions from many Phrygian towns reflect precisely this new reality. At Achaemenea, 2 of the oldest surviving inscriptions concern Roman interests directly. One honors an Italian patron who supported the city, while another records the establishment of an official slave market under the supervision of a Roman magistrate. The appearance of these monuments reveals just how closely local civic life had become intertwined with Roman administration and commerce. Apamea offers another revealing example. One of its earliest surviving inscriptions commemorates a Roman merchant named Gaius Venonius Eros through a magnificent, bilingual dedication written in both Greek and Latin. Historical records indicate that his patron conducted extensive business throughout the province during the final decades of the Roman Republic. Similar evidence appears elsewhere. At Laodicea, local citizens publicly honored a Roman commercial agent, while other inscriptions preserve the names of Italian merchants who settled permanently with their families in the region. These were no longer temporary visitors. They represented growing Roman communities that became permanent features of Phrygian society. Over time, their freedmen, business partners, and descendants spread throughout the countryside, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond the major cities. Perhaps even more important than their commercial activities was their influence on public life itself. As Roman merchants established themselves within Phrygian communities, public inscriptions multiplied rapidly. Cities increasingly commemorated benefactors through honorific statues, inscribed monuments, and official decrees. This new habit of recording civic decisions permanently in stone spread with remarkable speed across the region. Roman residents also became active participants in local government. At Prymnesos, one of the earliest surviving public inscriptions records honors jointly granted by the local assembly and the community of resident Romans engaged in business there. Similar arrangements appear elsewhere. At Dorylion, a public monument was erected not only by the city council and people, but also by the Roman merchants living within the settlement. At Akmonaia, another inscription records an unusual organization composed of both Greek and Roman women who participated alongside the city's traditional political institutions. Their association appears to have mirrored elite female organizations known from Rome itself, illustrating how Roman customs were gradually becoming embedded within local civic life. Apamea provides perhaps the clearest example of this growing integration. Throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, resident Romans regularly participated in public assemblies, civic decisions, and municipal government. One inscription proudly commemorates the first occasion on which Romans occupied every major magistracy within the city's governing administration, demonstrating just how fully Roman settlers had become incorporated into local political life. These developments transformed more than administrative institutions. They reshaped the very identity of Phrygian communities. Cities that had once expressed themselves primarily through local traditions increasingly adopted the language, symbols, and public ceremonies of the wider Greco. Roman world. Honorary decrees, civic councils, public statues, magistrates, assemblies, and coinage all became visible expressions of collective identity. Membership in a city was no longer defined solely by local custom, but also through participation in institutions recognizable across the Roman East. Yet an important question remains. Did these new civic identities reflect a genuine transformation of everyday life, or did they simply provide communities with a new public image while rural society remained fundamentally unchanged? Answering this question is surprisingly difficult. Archaeologists possess abundant evidence from spectacular cities such as Laodicea, Hierapolis, Antioch in Pisidia, and Aizanoi, all of which display impressive monuments, temples, theaters, and public buildings. However, these exceptional urban centers represented only a tiny fraction of Roman Phrygia. Most Phrygian polis were much smaller. Communities such as Akmonaia, Eumenea, Appia, Prymnessos, Sebaste, Kadoi, and many others were modest agricultural towns rather than great metropolitan centers. Although they possessed councils, assemblies, magistrates, and occasionally issued bronze coins, they almost certainly lacked the monumental scale and economic complexity of larger cities like Hierapolis or Laodicea. This distinction is essential. The presence of Greek-style political institutions did not necessarily transform every settlement into a thriving urban center. Many Phrygian communities remained overwhelmingly rural despite adopting the outward appearance of Greek civic life. Their economies still depended primarily upon farming and livestock, while their populations remained relatively small and scattered across the countryside. The Roman period therefore did not erase the distinctive character of Phrygia. Instead, it layered new political and cultural institutions onto an older rural landscape that had already followed a unique historical path. Public life increasingly resembled that of the Greek cities along the Aegean coast, yet beneath this civic facade remained communities whose daily existence continued to revolve around agriculture, village life, and local traditions. In many respects, this combination became the defining feature of Roman Phrygia. It was neither a purely Greek nor a purely Roman society, nor did it preserve an untouched Phrygian past. Instead, it evolved into a distinctive frontier province where local traditions, Hellenistic civic culture, and Roman political power merged into a new regional identity. Ancient Phrygia had once been a kingdom, later a decentralized countryside, and finally a landscape of modest self-governing cities connected by the institutions of the Roman Empire. Each stage built upon the one before it, producing one of the most distinctive cultural transformations anywhere in ancient Anatolia. At first glance, Roman Phrygia appears to have become a thoroughly urban province. Across the region stood cities with temples, theaters, marketplaces, gymnasia, and impressive public monuments. Local councils passed decrees, magistrates governed civic affairs, bronze coins carried the names of individual communities, and public inscriptions celebrated benefactors much like those found throughout the Greek-speaking world. Yet, appearances can be deceptive. Behind this impressive civic landscape lay a society that remained overwhelmingly rural. Many places officially recognized as cities were, in practical terms, little different from large agricultural villages. Their monumental architecture projected the image of prosperous urban centers, but their economies, populations, and daily life remained firmly rooted in the countryside. To understand Roman Phrygia, it is therefore necessary to distinguish between the appearance of urbanization and the actual structure of society. One of the best examples is the small city of Blandos in southwestern Phrygia. Perched dramatically on a rocky plateau overlooking the deep gorge of the Hipporios River, Blandos occupied a naturally defensible position high above the surrounding countryside. Archaeological surveys reveal that its central settlement covered only 4 or 5 hectares, with houses spreading more thinly along the neighboring slopes. Despite its modest size, Blandos possessed nearly every architectural feature expected of a respectable Greco-Roman city. A broad colonnaded avenue formed the town's principal street. Elegant Doric porticos lined both sides of this road, creating an impressive public space for merchants and pedestrians. Nearby stood a substantial temple of Demeter, together with a large gymnasium where education, athletic training, and civic life came together. South of the main street lay an open marketplace accompanied by a basilica, while a theater and stadium occupied the eastern hillside. Outside the settlement itself rose another major temple complex that dominated the surrounding landscape. Anyone arriving at Blandos would immediately recognize it as a city. Its streets, monuments, temples, and public buildings reflected the architectural language of the Roman East with remarkable confidence. Greek and Latin inscriptions appeared throughout the settlement, and bilingual texts demonstrate that Greek-speaking inhabitants and Roman immigrants lived side by side. Even a nearby monument records a mixed community of Romans and Greeks sharing the same district. Yet beneath this impressive appearance lay a very different reality. Compared with the famous cities of Western Asia Minor, Blandos was extraordinarily small. Estimates suggest that the urban center itself may have housed little more than 1,000 permanent residents. Even when the surrounding countryside is included, the total population probably reached only around 5,000 people. The theater provides an important clue. With seating for approximately 1,600 spectators, it was considerably smaller than theaters in neighboring regions. Rather than serving tens of thousands of urban residents, it was designed for a relatively modest local population drawn largely from nearby farms and villages. Most of these people were not merchants, craftsmen, or professional administrators. They were farmers. Many families who lived within the town cultivated fields only a short distance beyond its walls. Others spent much of their lives working the surrounding countryside before returning to houses clustered around the civic center. In economic terms, there was remarkably little difference between those living inside Blandos and those residing in the dependent rural territory surrounding it. The city functioned less as an independent economic engine than as a gathering place for an agricultural community. For this reason, historians often describe Blandos not as a true urban economy, but as an agro-town. Its primary purpose was not manufacturing, large-scale commerce, or industrial specialization. Instead, it concentrated farmers, landowners, religious institutions, and local government within a single settlement while leaving agriculture as the foundation of everyday life. What makes Blandos especially fascinating is the source of its monumental architecture. The impressive porticos, temples, and public spaces do not appear to reflect the accumulated wealth of the community as a whole. Instead, much of this construction was financed by 2 exceptionally wealthy Roman landowners, Gaius Mummius Macer and Gaius Octavius. Their generosity transformed the appearance of the town, but it did not fundamentally alter its economic structure. Monumental buildings projected prosperity, civic pride, and Roman culture, yet the overwhelming majority of the population continued living as ordinary agricultural producers. The city looked grander than its economy actually was. This distinction is crucial because Blandos was not unique. Many of the smaller cities scattered across Roman Phrygia likely resembled Blandos far more closely than they resembled metropolitan centers such as Ephesus or Pergamon. Their institutions were genuinely urban, but their populations remained largely rural. The same pattern appears in another important Phrygian city, Apamea. Ancient geographer Strabo described Apamea as one of the greatest commercial centers in Asia Minor, second only to Ephesus itself. At first glance, such praise suggests a thriving metropolis filled with merchants and permanent residents. Yet, archaeological and historical evidence paints a more complicated picture. Rather than supporting an enormous permanent population, Apamea appears to have functioned primarily as a regional gathering point. Merchants, farmers, travelers, tax collectors, and officials periodically converged upon the city to conduct business, attend markets, participate in civic ceremonies, and settle administrative affairs before returning to their homes scattered across southern Phrygia. In this sense, Apamea served as an institutional center rather than a densely populated metropolis. Its influence extended across a vast hinterland, yet much of the surrounding population remained dispersed among villages and rural estates. The city's importance rested less on the number of people living permanently within its walls than on the services it provided to an enormous surrounding region. This distinction reveals one of the greatest paradoxes of Roman Phrygia. Urban culture expanded rapidly throughout the province. Cities built theaters, temples, gymnasia, and marketplaces. Councils governed local affairs. Bronze coinage proclaimed civic identities. Public decrees honored distinguished citizens. Outwardly, Phrygia looked increasingly similar to the highly urbanized provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, however, genuine urbanization remained surprisingly limited. The overwhelming majority of the population continued farming the land. Specialized urban industries remained relatively small. Strong economic divisions between city dwellers and rural villagers failed to emerge. Instead of becoming economically dominant over their countryside, most Phrygian cities remained deeply dependent upon it. Later, imperial decisions illustrate just how flexible the concept of a city remained in Phrygia. During the reign of Diocletian in the early 4th century AD, the community of Timandos received official recognition as a polis. Interestingly, the emperor showed little concern for its size, architecture, or population. His primary consideration was whether the settlement possessed enough wealthy local citizens to fill the required civic offices and support municipal administration. A similar story unfolded at Orkistos several decades later. Originally classified as a village under the authority of neighboring Anatolia, Orkistos petitioned Emperor Constantine for promotion to city status. Constantine approved the request because the settlement occupied an important road junction, possessed bathhouses, watermills, a marketplace, reliable water supplies, and a substantial permanent population. These practical considerations mattered far more than impressive architecture or urban density. Even the emperor felt compelled to emphasize that Orkistos contained many permanent residents, implying that such a feature could not automatically be assumed for settlements claiming to be cities in Phrygia. Beneath these formal civic institutions, Phrygian society remained remarkably decentralized. Villages retained considerable independence from nearby urban centers. Political authority rarely extended deeply into the countryside, and relationships between cities and their rural territories remained relatively loose compared with other parts of the Roman Empire. Perhaps the clearest evidence for this local independence appears in Phrygia's funerary monuments. Nearly every town developed its own distinctive burial customs, inscription formulas, and artistic styles. Tombstones from Apamea followed characteristic wording found almost nowhere else. At Eumenea, many funerary inscriptions displayed the mysterious word door, a feature unique to that community. Around Akmonia, tomb monuments frequently took the form of decorated stone altars crowned with pine cones or omphalos symbols, another tradition confined almost entirely to the surrounding district. These differences may appear minor, but together they reveal something profoundly important. Cultural practices remained intensely local. Even neighboring communities often expressed identity through entirely different artistic traditions, religious language, and commemorative customs. Such extraordinary local diversity suggests that Roman Phrygia never developed into a tightly integrated urban society. Instead, it remained a mosaic of relatively independent communities, each preserving its own traditions while simultaneously participating in the broader political and cultural framework of the Roman Empire. Ultimately, Roman Phrygia presents a fascinating historical paradox. It possessed the institutions of cities without becoming fully urban. It embraced Greek and Roman civic culture without abandoning its deeply rural character. Magnificent temples, theaters, inscriptions, and public buildings projected the image of a flourishing urban civilization, yet everyday life continued to revolve around farming, local villages, and small autonomous communities. In many ways, this unique balance explains why Phrygia remained unlike any other province of the Roman East. It successfully adopted the language of empire while preserving the decentralized social landscape that had characterized the region for centuries. Rather than replacing its rural foundations, Roman civilization simply built a civic facade upon them, creating a province that looked urban from the outside but remained profoundly local at its core. The story of ancient Phrygia is unlike that of almost any other civilization in the Mediterranean world. Most societies gradually became more centralized, more urban, and more politically complex over time. Phrygia followed a very different path. It reached an impressive level of development early in its history, only to reverse course centuries later. Rather than expanding into an increasingly powerful kingdom, it slowly abandoned many of the institutions that had once made it one of Anatolia's leading states. During the early 1st millennium BC, Phrygia ranked among the most sophisticated societies in the eastern Mediterranean. At a time when many Greek communities were still relatively small and politically fragmented, the Phrygian kingdom possessed impressive royal centers, monumental architecture, organized administration, widespread literacy, specialized craftsmen, and clear social hierarchies. Monumental construction projects demonstrated the ability of rulers to mobilize enormous numbers of workers, while large workshops reveal an economy capable of centralized production on a remarkable scale. In many respects, Iron Age Phrygia stood ahead of many of its contemporaries. Yet, this position did not last. Following the Persian conquest of Anatolia during the middle of the 6th century BC, Phrygian society entered one of the most unusual periods in its history. The centralized kingdom gradually disappeared. Royal institutions lost their influence, monumental construction almost ceased, and the complex administrative structures that had once organized political and economic life slowly dissolved. The transformation extended far beyond politics alone. Writing, once widely used throughout the kingdom, gradually disappeared from everyday life. In some districts, literacy vanished almost completely for centuries before returning during the Roman imperial period. Economic organization also changed. Agriculture remained important, but archaeological evidence suggests that parts of the Anatolian plateau increasingly shifted toward livestock raising and more extensive pastoral economies. Communities became smaller, production became more localized, and social specialization declined. Rather than growing more complex, Phrygia became simpler. This transformation shaped every stage of the region's later history. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Greek and Macedonian settlers poured into central Anatolia. New cities appeared, military colonies were established, and Greek became the dominant language of administration and public life. In many districts, especially the Central Valleys and Northern Plains, these newcomers formed the social and political elite, while the indigenous Phrygian population adapted to varying degrees. Some communities embraced Hellenistic customs rapidly, while others retained older traditions for generations. Roman rule accelerated these changes even further. Beginning in the 1st century BC, public inscriptions multiplied across Phrygia, local cities began issuing bronze coinage, civic councils became increasingly visible, and monumental public buildings appeared throughout the province. Italian merchants, bankers, freedmen, and entrepreneurs settled in growing numbers, bringing Phrygia ever more closely into the economic orbit of the Roman Empire. On the surface, the province appeared to have become a thoroughly urbanized part of the Roman world, yet appearances can be misleading. Beneath this impressive civic facade, Phrygia remained fundamentally rural. Although dozens of settlements officially possessed the status of cities, many were little larger than substantial farming villages. Their councils passed decrees, their magistrates governed civic affairs, and their bronze coins proclaimed urban identity, but their populations continued to depend overwhelmingly upon agriculture and animal husbandry. Unlike the great metropolitan centers of the Mediterranean, most Phrygian cities never developed large manufacturing sectors or sharply differentiated urban economies. Farmers often lived within the city itself while cultivating fields only a short distance beyond its walls. Urban centers functioned primarily as places where local government, religious ceremonies, markets, and seasonal trade took place rather than as densely populated economic engines. The outward symbols of urban civilization therefore concealed a much older social structure. Roman administration certainly introduced new institutions, but it did not fundamentally reorganize the countryside. Settlement patterns remained highly decentralized, villages preserved considerable autonomy, and local communities continued managing much of their own economic life without strong dependence upon distant urban centers. Even under Roman rule, Phrygia retained the fragmented character that had emerged centuries earlier following the disappearance of its Iron Age kingdom. This continuity appears especially clearly in the funerary monuments scattered across the region. The most elaborate tombstones of Roman Phrygia rarely celebrated military victories, political careers, or commercial wealth. Instead, they consistently emphasized the world of ordinary work. Stone reliefs depict plows, vineyards, sheep, oxen, agricultural tools, carts, and beasts of burden alongside writing tablets or Roman clothing. These monuments present farming and pastoral life not as humble occupations but as honorable foundations of society itself. The inscriptions tell the same story. Across the Phrygian highlands and the western edge of the great Anatolian steppe, individuals proudly identified themselves as farmers in their own epitaphs. Elsewhere, craftsmen celebrated their professions with equal pride. Stonemasons, blacksmiths, die engravers, knife makers, and other skilled workers frequently recorded their occupations directly on their monuments, sometimes even illustrating the tools of their trade in carved relief. Such expressions are remarkably revealing. Throughout much of the Roman Empire, funerary monuments often emphasized political office, military distinction, or social rank. In Phrygia, however, productive labor itself became a central source of personal identity. Farming was not something to conceal beneath elite status. It was a quality worthy of public remembrance. Even members of prosperous local families were praised first for their diligence and hard work before any mention of wealth or influence. This emphasis suggests that Roman cultural values penetrated Phrygian society only partially. Greek language, Roman political institutions, and civic administration certainly spread throughout the province, but older attitudes toward work, community, and local identity remained deeply rooted. Agricultural production continued to occupy the center of social life, and productive labor retained a prestige rarely matched elsewhere in the Roman world. Taken together, this evidence invites a very different interpretation of Phrygia's long history. For generations, historians viewed the disappearance of the Iron Age kingdom as evidence of decline. Compared with the powerful state that had once flourished under rulers like Midas, later Phrygia seemed politically weak, economically underdeveloped, and socially fragmented. But another interpretation is possible. Perhaps Phrygia did not simply fail to rebuild its former state. Perhaps its society gradually evolved in ways that discouraged the return of centralized authority. Smaller communities, decentralized production, widespread local autonomy, and limited social hierarchy made it far more difficult for powerful institutions to dominate everyday life. Whether this outcome resulted from conscious choice, historical circumstance, or countless local decisions accumulated over centuries remains impossible to know with certainty. Yet the pattern itself is unmistakable. Even after the arrival of Greeks, Macedonians, and Romans, Phrygia never fully abandoned the decentralized character that had emerged following the collapse of its ancient kingdom. Political institutions changed repeatedly, but the underlying organization of society remained remarkably stable. This perspective echoes a broader pattern found throughout human history. Across prehistoric Europe, Anatolia, and the ancient Near East, centralized societies repeatedly emerged only to fragment once again. Whenever political institutions became too coercive or hierarchical, communities often dispersed into smaller social units where local independence could be preserved. Strong states were not always the inevitable destination of history. Sometimes, people simply chose another path. Phrygia offers one of the clearest surviving examples of that alternative. For nearly 1,000 years, from the collapse of its Iron Age kingdom until well into the Roman imperial period, its villages, farming communities, and small towns maintained a society built less upon powerful governments than upon local autonomy, productive labor, and decentralized rural life. Empires came and went. Persian kings, Macedonian generals, Hellenistic monarchs, and Roman emperors all claimed authority over the region. Yet beneath every imperial administration, the everyday rhythms of Phrygian society remained strikingly consistent. In the end, the history of Phrygia is not simply the story of a kingdom that disappeared, it is the story of a society that repeatedly adapted without surrendering its local foundations. While neighboring civilizations pursued ever greater political centralization, Phrygia preserved a remarkably different vision of social organization, one in which villages, farmers, craftsmen, and local communities continued to shape history long after kingdoms had vanished. The history of Phrygia stands apart from that of nearly every other civilization in the ancient Mediterranean. While most societies gradually evolved into larger, more centralized states with increasingly complex political institutions, Phrygia followed a strikingly different course. It reached a remarkable level of development during the early 1st millennium BC, only to move in the opposite direction centuries later. Instead of expanding its state and strengthening royal authority, it gradually abandoned many of the institutions that had once made it one of Anatolia's most powerful kingdoms. At its height, Iron Age Phrygia possessed many of the characteristics normally associated with an advanced civilization. Monumental architecture dominated important cities, literacy was firmly established, skilled craftsmen worked in highly organized production centers, and political authority rested in the hands of powerful hereditary rulers. Large ceremonial complexes, royal residences, and administrative institutions reveal a society capable of coordinating enormous resources while maintaining a sophisticated social hierarchy. Compared with many contemporary Greek communities, Phrygia displayed a surprisingly high degree of political organization and economic specialization. Yet this early advantage gradually disappeared. Following the Persian conquest of Anatolia in the middle of the 6th century BC, Phrygian society entered a long period of transformation. The centralized kingdom slowly dissolved, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a gradual weakening of the institutions that had sustained it. Royal authority faded, monumental construction almost ceased, literacy declined dramatically, and the highly specialized economy that had once characterized the kingdom became increasingly localized. In several regions, written language vanished entirely for centuries before eventually returning during the Roman imperial period. Archaeological evidence also suggests that parts of the Anatolian plateau shifted away from intensive agriculture toward broader pastoral economies, centered on livestock rather than large-scale cultivation. This process fundamentally reshaped everything that followed. When Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire, Greek and Macedonian settlers established colonies across central Anatolia. New cities appeared, military veterans received land, and Greek gradually became the dominant language of administration and public life. In many districts, especially the fertile valleys of central and northern Phrygia, these newcomers formed the political and economic elite. Native Phrygian communities responded in different ways. Some adopted Greek customs relatively quickly, while others preserved older traditions for generations, creating a cultural landscape in which multiple identities coexisted side by side. The arrival of Roman rule introduced another major transformation. During the 1st century BC, civic institutions spread rapidly across Phrygia. Local councils issued public decrees, cities began minting their own bronze coinage, and inscriptions multiplied throughout the countryside. Italian merchants, financiers, freedmen, and entrepreneurs settled in growing numbers, strengthening the region's commercial ties with the wider Roman world. On the surface, Phrygia increasingly resembled the highly urbanized provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean, complete with marketplaces, public buildings, civic assemblies, and municipal governments. Yet this image concealed a very different reality. Most Phrygian cities remained remarkably small. Their populations continued to rely overwhelmingly on farming and animal husbandry, and there was little distinction between urban residents and the rural communities surrounding them. Farmers frequently lived inside city walls while cultivating nearby fields, and many settlements functioned more as administrative centers than as genuine economic hubs. Monumental architecture created the appearance of urban prosperity, but beneath that civic facade lay a society whose foundations remained overwhelmingly agricultural and decentralized. Unlike the great commercial cities of the Roman Empire, Phrygian towns rarely developed highly specialized urban economies. Instead, they served as places where markets were held, legal affairs were conducted, religious festivals were celebrated, and local government operated. Their surrounding countryside continued to dominate both production and everyday life. In practical terms, Roman administration changed the language of public institutions far more than it transformed the basic organization of society. The funerary monuments of Roman Phrygia reveal this continuity with remarkable clarity. Across the region, tombstones consistently celebrate the world of productive labor. Relief sculptures depict plows cutting through fields, oxen pulling carts, shepherds tending sheep, vineyards heavy with grapes, agricultural tools, and the everyday equipment of rural life. Alongside these familiar scenes occasionally appear Roman garments, writing tablets, or other symbols of civic status. But agriculture and pastoral work remain at the center of the visual message. These monuments express a society that continued to define itself primarily through labor rather than political office or military distinction. The inscriptions carved upon these monuments reinforce the same impression. Many individuals proudly identified themselves simply as farmers. Others emphasized their occupations as stonemasons, blacksmiths, craftsmen, engravers, or knife makers. Rather than concealing manual labor beneath claims of elite status, they presented productive work as an honorable source of identity worthy of permanent remembrance. Even wealthy local citizens were often praised first for their diligence, industry, and usefulness before any mention of their social position. Such values distinguished Phrygia from much of the Roman world. Elsewhere across the empire, funerary monuments frequently celebrated military service, political careers, aristocratic ancestry, or municipal offices. In Phrygia, however, farming, craftsmanship, and productive labor occupied a far more prominent place in public memory. This emphasis suggests that although Greek language, Roman administration, and civic institutions spread successfully throughout the province, they never completely replaced older local ideals. Beneath the outward appearance of Roman civilization survived a social outlook that continued to value self-sufficiency, practical work, and village life above the symbols of imperial prestige. This observation raises a larger historical question. For generations, historians viewed the disappearance of the Iron Age Phrygian kingdom simply as evidence of decline. Compared with the powerful state that had flourished centuries earlier, later Phrygia appeared politically fragmented, economically modest, and socially underdeveloped. Judged solely by the standards of centralized government and urban growth, the region seemed to have failed. But another interpretation deserves serious consideration. Rather than viewing this transformation as collapse, it may be understood as the gradual emergence of a society that functioned according to different priorities. After the disappearance of the Old Kingdom, political institutions never again achieved the same degree of centralized authority. Communities remained relatively small, economic production stayed localized, and strong local traditions discouraged the reappearance of powerful hierarchical structures. Whether this outcome resulted from deliberate choice, historical circumstance, or countless practical adaptations made over many generations cannot be known with certainty. Nevertheless, the long-term pattern is unmistakable. Throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Phrygia consistently resisted becoming a highly centralized society despite repeated opportunities to do so. Its villages retained considerable independence, local customs remained remarkably resilient, and social life continued revolving around agriculture and small communities rather than large bureaucratic institutions. Greek kings, Roman governors, and imperial officials all exercised authority over the region, yet beneath these successive political systems, everyday life changed surprisingly little. This broader perspective places Phrygia within a recurring pattern visible throughout human history. Across prehistoric Europe, Anatolia, and the ancient Near East, complex societies repeatedly emerged before fragmenting once again. Political centralization was never an irreversible process. Communities frequently dispersed into smaller, more autonomous units whenever large states weakened or ceased to provide clear advantages. Strong. Governments may appear inevitable in retrospect, but history often followed far more flexible paths. Phrygia represents one of the clearest surviving examples of such an alternative trajectory. For nearly a millennium after the collapse of its Iron Age kingdom, the region maintained a society rooted in local autonomy, productive labor, decentralized settlement, and village communities. Empires rose and fell around it. Persians, Macedonians, Hellenistic monarchs, and Romans each imposed new systems of government, introduced new languages, and established new institutions. Yet beneath these changing political frameworks, the essential character of Phrygian society remained remarkably consistent. Ultimately, the history of Phrygia is not simply the story of a kingdom that disappeared. It is the story of a people who repeatedly adapted to changing political circumstances without abandoning the local foundations of their society. While many neighboring civilizations pursued increasing centralization, Phrygia preserved a distinctive balance between participation in great empires and the independence of its rural communities. That balance shaped its history for centuries and remains one of the most unusual and fascinating social experiments in the ancient world. Defining what it meant to be Phrygian was never as straightforward as drawing a line on a map. Ancient Phrygia had no fixed cultural frontier, no single language spoken by everyone, and no universally accepted identity shared by all who lived within its territory. Throughout its history, people, languages, religions, and traditions overlapped so extensively that identifying a clear boundary between Phrygia and its neighbors becomes almost impossible. Language, for example, tells only part of the story. The Phrygian language once spread across a vast area of central Anatolia, surviving for centuries before gradually disappearing under the influence of Greek. Yet the decline of the language did not necessarily mean the disappearance of the people themselves. A community could abandon its ancestral tongue while continuing to preserve its customs, traditions, and sense of belonging. Just as many modern nations define themselves by far more than language alone, the inhabitants of Roman Phrygia could still consider themselves Phrygian even after adopting Greek as their everyday means of communication. Personal names are equally unreliable guides. Throughout Roman Phrygia, inscriptions reveal an extraordinary mixture of Greek, Latin, and indigenous names. Within the same family, one individual might bear a traditional Greek name, another, a Roman one, while a third preserved an ancient local name, whose origins stretched back centuries before either Greek or Roman rule. Cultural identity clearly proved far more flexible than simple labels carved into stone. Geography complicates the picture even further. Phrygia itself was never a uniform landscape. Fertile river valleys, dry steppes, forested mountains, volcanic plateaus, and rolling grazing lands all belong to the same broad cultural region. These very different environments naturally encourage different ways of life. Some districts specialized in vineyards and orchards, others depended primarily upon grain cultivation, while many upland communities relied heavily upon sheep, horses, and cattle. Even ancient writers noticed these regional contrasts. Some described Phrygia as a land rich in vineyards, particularly along the Sangarios River. Others emphasized its enormous flocks of sheep, praising the region as one of the richest pastoral landscapes in Anatolia. Both descriptions were accurate because they referred to different parts of the same remarkably diverse country. Despite these local differences, one theme united almost every part of Phrygia. Agriculture remained the foundation of life. According to legend, the kingdom's founder, Gordios, was discovered while plowing his fields with a pair of oxen before unexpectedly rising to kingship. Whether historically true or not, the story reflects the values later generations associated with Phrygia. Even its greatest ruler emerged not from a royal palace, but from the agricultural world that sustained ordinary society. The same emphasis appears centuries later throughout Roman Phrygia. Funerary monuments consistently depict plows, vineyards, pruning hooks, oxen, carts, sheep, and other symbols of rural labor. Agriculture was not merely an occupation, it formed the heart of local identity. The Great Mother herself, one of Phrygia's most important deities, continued to be associated with fertility, grain, and the productive power of the countryside even after her worship spread across the Roman Empire. This agricultural character also shaped Phrygia's urban life. Modern observers often imagine a sharp distinction between city and countryside, but such divisions were far less obvious in Roman Phrygia. Towns like Anatolia certainly possessed theaters, temples, marketplaces, and civic institutions, yet they remained deeply connected to the surrounding agricultural landscape. Farmers frequently lived within the town itself while cultivating nearby fields, and many aspects of urban life remained closely tied to seasonal agricultural rhythms. Indeed, archaeological evidence suggests that smaller rural communities sometimes proved more resilient than cities. When the political and economic crises of the 3rd century AD affected the Roman Empire, prosperous cities such as Anatolia experienced serious decline. Their monumental building projects slowed, public workshops disappeared, and urban prosperity weakened considerably. Meanwhile, smaller agricultural communities in regions like the Upper Tembris Valley continued functioning with relatively little disruption. Their decentralized economies, dependent upon local farming rather than urban commerce, proved surprisingly durable during periods of imperial instability. This resilience raises an intriguing question. What did ordinary inhabitants actually think of themselves? Most farmers probably did not spend much time reflecting upon broad ethnic identities. Their immediate concerns were far more practical: their fields, vineyards, livestock, neighbors, and village. Political boundaries shifted repeatedly as Persians, Macedonians, Hellenistic kings, and Romans succeeded one another. Yet daily life continued to revolve around local communities rather than distant governments. For many people, the word homeland referred not to all of Phrygia, but simply to their own village or nearby town. Their strongest loyalty belonged to the small community in which they were born, worked, and buried. Questions about the wider boundaries of Phrygia likely mattered far less than local property lines, irrigation rights, taxation, or relations with neighboring settlements. Religion followed similar patterns. Indigenous cults spread widely across Anatolia, crossing political frontiers with little concern for provincial boundaries. Sacred traditions linked communities through shared rituals rather than administrative divisions. Visitors, however, often viewed Phrygia very differently. Travelers praised the region for its magnificent horses, fertile fields, and immense flocks of sheep. Immigrants who settled there frequently described it in glowing language, emphasizing its agricultural abundance and natural wealth. Such compliments contrast sharply with the everyday concerns reflected on local funerary monuments, where attention focused instead upon vineyards, pruning hooks, oxen, spinning tools, and the practical equipment of rural life. Ancient legal traditions reveal just how valuable these everyday possessions were. One remarkable account reports that killing a plow ox or stealing agricultural tools could be punished with death. Whether or not this law was always enforced exactly as described, it illustrates the immense importance attached to farming within Phrygian society. Livestock and agricultural equipment were not simply economic assets, they formed the foundation of survival itself. At the same time, Phrygia carried a complicated reputation throughout the ancient world. Greek and Roman authors often portrayed the Phrygians as gentle, submissive, or lacking military spirit. Such stereotypes had developed over centuries as the region passed successively under Lydian, Persian, Macedonian, Hellenistic, and Roman rule. By the imperial period, many outsiders viewed Phrygia as a land of peaceful farmers rather than warriors. Yet stereotypes rarely tell the whole story. Although Phrygia produced few large-scale rebellions against Roman authority, its apparent quietness should not be mistaken for weakness. The region's decentralized society, built around villages rather than powerful cities, offered relatively few opportunities for organized political resistance. Agricultural communities also faced practical constraints. Crops could be burned, vineyards destroyed, and livestock driven away with devastating consequences. Open rebellion carried enormous risks for populations whose livelihoods depended entirely upon the land. Instead of military confrontation, Phrygian society often displayed another form of resilience. Its communities preserved their traditions despite centuries of foreign rule. Greek language spread, Roman administration arrived, and successive empires imposed new political structures, yet local customs, religious practices, agricultural values, and village identities endured. Cultural continuity proved stronger than political change. This persistence helps explain why defining Phrygia remains so difficult. It was never simply a kingdom, a language, a province, or a single ethnic group. It was a landscape where different peoples mixed, where religions crossed political frontiers, where Greek and indigenous traditions blended, and where local communities often mattered more than distant capitals. The true identity of Phrygia emerged not from rigid boundaries, but from countless villages, valleys, and farming communities whose shared way of life survived every empire that claimed to rule them. In the end, perhaps the most accurate definition of a Phrygian is the simplest one. It was someone who belonged to this land, worked its fields, honored its local traditions, and regarded its villages, not imperial capitals, as the true center of the world. That quiet attachment to community, agriculture, and local identity endured far longer than any kingdom, language, or empire, making it the most enduring legacy of Phrygia itself. Religion occupied a uniquely important place in the lives of the people of Roman Phrygia. After centuries of foreign domination under Persians, Macedonians, Hellenistic kings, and Romans, political independence had largely disappeared, but religious life remained deeply rooted within local communities. Villages, shrines, and sacred traditions provided a sense of continuity that imperial governments could never replace. In many ways, religion became one of the strongest expressions of Phrygian identity. Ancient writers frequently described the Phrygians as an exceptionally religious people. According to one tradition, even the legendary King Midas was remembered not only for his wealth, but also for encouraging religious devotion among his subjects. Whether historical or not, the story reflects how later generations viewed Phrygia, a land where spiritual life occupied the center of society rather than its margins. This devotion appeared in two very different forms. On one hand stood the great sanctuary of Cybele, the mother goddess, whose worship attracted pilgrims from across Anatolia and eventually throughout the Roman Empire. Massive temple complexes, powerful priesthoods, elaborate ceremonies, and dramatic religious festivals made these sanctuaries among the most influential sacred centers in the ancient world. Their priests negotiated directly with Roman officials and exercised considerable authority over surrounding regions. On the other hand, existed a quieter form of religion practiced in countless villages scattered across the Phrygian countryside. Here, local farmers worshipped modest rural deities, prayed for healthy crops and livestock, and sought divine protection for their families and settlements. Their religious life lacked the spectacle of the great temples, yet it was no less important. It formed part of the everyday rhythm of village existence and reflected the agricultural foundations of Phrygian society. These two worlds were not isolated from one another. The famous sanctuary at Aizanoi illustrates how local and monumental religion could become closely connected. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest focus of worship centered upon a sacred cave associated with the mother goddess. Over time, however, the principal cult shifted toward the magnificent temple of Zeus that later dominated the city. A ceremonial road eventually linked the cave and the temple, symbolizing the gradual evolution of local religious traditions into larger public cults without completely abandoning their older origins. Priests played an essential role throughout this religious landscape. Whether serving great temples or tiny rural shrines, they acted as intermediaries between ordinary people and the divine. Alongside priests appeared prophets, holy men, and other spiritual figures who interpreted the will of the gods and guided local communities through religious life. When Christianity later spread across Phrygia, bishops gradually inherited many of these responsibilities, becoming the new spiritual leaders of towns and villages while continuing traditions of local religious authority that stretched back centuries. One of the most remarkable features of Phrygian religion was its emphasis on personal responsibility. Across the countryside, hundreds of inscribed monuments record what modern scholars often call confession inscriptions. These texts reveal individuals publicly acknowledging wrongdoing, explaining how divine punishment had followed their actions, and promising to correct their behavior. The offenses varied widely. Some involved dishonesty, broken oaths, ritual impurity, or disrespect toward the gods. Others concerned disputes with neighbors or failures to fulfill religious obligations. In many cases, punishment had already occurred before the inscription was carved. Illness, blindness, misfortune, or other hardships were interpreted as signs of divine judgment. By publicly admitting guilt and honoring the offended deity, the individual hoped to restore harmony both with the gods and with the surrounding community. These inscriptions were far more than private acts of repentance. They functioned as public demonstrations of morality, reminding entire villages that divine justice extended into every aspect of daily life. Religious belief therefore reinforced social order in places where formal civic institutions often remained relatively weak. Rather than relying solely upon courts or government officials, communities also depended upon the fear of divine punishment to encourage honesty, fairness, and mutual responsibility. This emphasis on moral accountability also helps explain why Phrygia became fertile ground for new religious movements. The region produced some of the most influential Christian movements of late antiquity, including Montanism. Founded by the prophet Montanus during the 2nd century AD, this movement emphasized direct inspiration from the Holy Spirit, ecstatic prophecy, strict moral discipline, and preparation for the coming kingdom of God. Although Christianity itself originated elsewhere, Montanism found particularly receptive audiences within Phrygia because many of its characteristics echoed long-established local religious traditions. Its followers valued prophecy, emotional religious experience, purification, and close-knit communities, all themes deeply familiar within the spiritual landscape of rural Phrygia. Other Christian groups followed similar patterns. Novatianism, another influential movement, attracted supporters through its uncompromising moral standards and insistence upon personal purity. Although its origins lay outside Phrygia, its strict ethical outlook resonated strongly with communities already accustomed to viewing religion as a guide for everyday conduct rather than simply a matter of public ritual. Beneath these various religious traditions lay a remarkably consistent worldview. Phrygian villages functioned as close-knit face-to-face societies where individuals knew one another personally and shared responsibility for maintaining social harmony. Justice, honesty, moderation, and self-control became central virtues not because they were imposed by distant governments, but because they sustained everyday life within small agricultural communities. Even local deities reflected this intimate relationship between religion and the natural world. Zeus Bronton, the Thunderer, protected people from storms. Zeus Ampelios watched over vineyards. The mother goddess embodied fertility, the earth, and agricultural abundance. These gods were inseparable from the landscape itself. Mountains, caves, fields, vineyards, and pastures shaped not only the economy of Phrygia, but also its spiritual imagination. As a result, religion turned people's attention inward rather than outward. Its primary concern was not imperial politics or distant wars, but the well-being of the village, the harvest, the family, and the moral conduct of neighbors. Self-discipline became one of the highest virtues. Ancient inscriptions repeatedly praise moderation, responsibility, and good character, especially in commemorating women whose wisdom and self-control were often celebrated alongside their devotion to family and community. Ultimately, religion in Roman Phrygia was far more than a collection of beliefs or rituals. It provided the moral framework through which ordinary people understood justice, punishment, forgiveness, and social responsibility. Great sanctuaries impressed visitors with their magnificent temples, but the true strength of Phrygian religion lay in its villages, where faith shaped everyday life as deeply as farming itself. Long after kingdoms had fallen and empires had come and gone, these local religious traditions continued to preserve a distinctive Phrygian way of seeing the world, one built upon community, morality, self-discipline, and an enduring belief that divine justice remained intimately connected to the ordinary lives of ordinary people. The identity of the Phrygians was never formed in isolation. From the very beginning of their history, they lived at the crossroads of civilizations, interacting with neighboring peoples while gradually creating a distinctive culture of their own. Long before they established their famous kingdom in central Anatolia, the Phrygians had already spent centuries living alongside Thracians and Greeks in the Balkans. These early contacts would leave a lasting mark on their language, customs, and even their personal names. After crossing into Asia Minor at the end of the 2nd millennium BC, the Phrygians settled first in Mysia and Bithynia, before gradually moving inland along the fertile valleys of the Sangarios and Tembris rivers. There they encountered an already diverse population that included descendants of the Hittites and Luwians, peoples whose civilizations had flourished in Anatolia centuries before the rise of Phrygia. Rather than replacing these older populations entirely, the newcomers gradually mixed with them, creating a society shaped by several cultural traditions instead of only one. This blending can be observed through one of the most personal aspects of everyday life: names. The earliest Phrygian inscriptions preserve roughly 60 identifiable personal names. Many clearly belong to the native Phrygian language, while others reveal strong Anatolian influences inherited from the peoples already living in central Anatolia. Certain dynastic names, including the famous royal name Midas, may themselves have deep Anatolian roots stretching back into the late Bronze Age. Alongside these appear numerous affectionate family names, sometimes called Lal Namen, simple names originally derived from children's speech that remained remarkably popular throughout Anatolia. Even in the earliest centuries of Phrygian history, cultural identity was therefore far more complex than simple ethnic labels might suggest. Foreign influence remained surprisingly limited during some periods. Despite ruling Anatolia for nearly 2 centuries, the Persian Empire left very little trace on traditional Phrygian naming customs. Only a handful of Persian names appear in the surviving evidence. Greek influence proved more significant, especially in regions lying close to the Aegean coast, where commercial and cultural contacts had existed for generations before Alexander the Great arrived. Even before the Macedonian conquest, some members of the Phrygian elite had already begun adopting Greek personal names while preserving many elements of their own cultural identity. Alexander's conquest accelerated this process dramatically. When Macedonian armies entered central Anatolia in 334 BC, they opened the interior of Asia Minor to the expanding Hellenistic world. Greek became the language of administration, commerce, and public life, while newly founded colonies brought thousands of Greek and Macedonian settlers into Phrygia. Within only a generation, many leading Phrygian families had adopted Greek names. One remarkable funerary inscription from the late 4th or early 3rd century BC records individuals with unmistakably Greek names while still writing in the Phrygian language. The Old Phrygian alphabet had disappeared, replaced by Greek letters, yet the language itself still survived. It was a vivid illustration of cultural adaptation without complete assimilation. The same trend appears at Gordion. Dozens of graffiti dating to the Hellenistic period preserve the names of ordinary inhabitants. Most are unmistakably Greek, while only a small number retain clearly Phrygian origins. The evidence suggests that Greek naming customs spread rapidly through much of society rather than remaining confined to political elites alone. At the same time, traces of Galatian influence also begin appearing after Celtic tribes settled parts of northern Phrygia during the 3rd century BC, adding another cultural layer to an already diverse population. Roman rule introduced yet another stage in this long process of transformation. After Augustus reorganized Asia Minor, Phrygia itself was divided between several Roman provinces. Greek remained the dominant language of everyday life, but Latin names increasingly appeared, especially in prosperous urban districts closely connected to Roman administration. Colonists, soldiers, merchants, and imperial officials brought Roman naming traditions into the region, while local elites often adopted Latin names to emphasize their connections with imperial authority. Yet the spread of Greek and Latin names did not completely erase older traditions. Across much of rural Phrygia, Greek names certainly dominated, often accounting for well over half of all individuals recorded in inscriptions. In major urban centers such as Aizanoi and Kotiaion, they became overwhelmingly common. Latin names also achieved impressive popularity in cities closely connected with Roman administration, especially at Pisidian Antioch, Laodicea, and Pessinus, where Roman political and economic influence remained particularly strong. In contrast, more isolated rural districts followed a different pattern. Although traditional Phrygian names became relatively rare, the old family names inherited from earlier Anatolian traditions survived remarkably well. These simple, affectionate names remained especially common in villages, the Phrygian highlands, and bilingual communities where the Phrygian language itself continued to be spoken. Such communities often combined Greek public culture with deeply rooted local traditions, producing a society in which cultural identity could not easily be measured simply by language or personal names. The diversity of Roman Phrygia becomes even clearer when examining individual families. Persian names occasionally survived from the Achaemenid period. Jewish communities introduced Hebrew names into several towns. Thracian names appeared through military migration, while Celtic names spread into northeastern Phrygia following Galatian settlement. One remarkable family from central Anatolia illustrates this extraordinary mixture. Within a single household appear a Phrygian father, a wife bearing a Greek name, a son with a Celtic name, another child carrying an ancient Anatolian family name, and an epitaph written in the Phrygian language. No clearer example could demonstrate the remarkable cultural blending that characterized Roman Phrygia. This diversity reminds us that identity in the ancient world was rarely simple. A person might speak Greek in public, preserve Phrygian traditions at home, bear a Roman legal name, worship an Anatolian deity, and belong to a family whose ancestors included Greeks, Phrygians, Galatians, and others. Cultural identity was not determined by a single language, religion, or ancestry. Instead, it evolved gradually through centuries of migration, coexistence, and adaptation. In many respects, that remarkable ability to absorb outside influences while preserving local traditions became one of Phrygia's defining characteristics. Kingdoms disappeared, empires rose and fell, and new peoples arrived from every direction. Yet beneath these constant changes survived a society whose identity remained rooted not in ethnic purity, but in the shared landscape, villages, traditions, and everyday lives of the people who called Phrygia home. By the Roman imperial period, the Phrygians had lived under foreign rule for centuries. Persian kings, Macedonian conquerors, Hellenistic dynasties, and finally the Roman Empire had each imposed new political systems upon the region. Yet despite this long history of conquest, the Phrygians did not simply disappear as a distinct people. Their language gradually declined, many of their customs changed, and Greek and Roman culture became increasingly dominant, but a sense of Phrygian identity continued to survive beneath the surface. One of the clearest examples comes from the famous sanctuary of Pessinus, where local communities actively defended what they regarded as their own religious and cultural traditions. Even after centuries of foreign domination, they still recognized themselves as Phrygians. However, preserving an ethnic identity proved easier than preserving older naming traditions. Throughout the Roman period, Greek personal names overwhelmingly dominated everyday life across Phrygia. Latin names also became increasingly common, particularly in prosperous towns and districts closely connected to Roman administration. Traditional Phrygian names survived only in relatively small numbers, scattered across inscriptions and isolated rural communities. Compared with earlier centuries, the old native naming system had been reduced to little more than a faint echo of its former self. Even so, it never vanished completely. Several ancient Phrygian names continued to survive well into the Roman imperial period, although often in modified forms. Some could be traced directly back to words already known from the earliest Phrygian inscriptions. One remarkable example is the name Iman. Originally an ordinary Phrygian word, probably connected with architecture or religious ritual, it gradually evolved into a personal name. Centuries later, it was still being used throughout eastern Phrygia, Pisidia, and neighboring districts, demonstrating that elements of the old language continued to survive even after most of it had disappeared from everyday speech. Other names reveal equally deep roots. Names such as Wanaxos, Wanaxon, and Wanaxion appear concentrated in central Phrygia and seem to preserve extremely ancient religious traditions. Rather than borrowing directly from Greek, they probably originated within the shared prehistoric heritage of both Greek and Phrygian cultures. Closely related expressions appear in royal titles associated with King Midas and in later religious inscriptions referring to divine beings. These names therefore preserve fragments of beliefs that stretched back hundreds of years before Roman rule. Another group of names seems to have been connected with local cults dedicated to Zeus Benios, a distinctly Phrygian form of Zeus worshipped mainly in the valleys of northwestern Phrygia. Individuals bearing names derived from this cult appear repeatedly in inscriptions from the region, suggesting that local religion continued to influence personal identity long after Greek became the dominant language. Several additional names appear almost exclusively within Phrygia itself. Women's names such as Vuna and Wenawia occur repeatedly across central and eastern Phrygia and are rarely found elsewhere. Linguists believe these names may preserve elements inherited from much older Anatolian languages, spoken long before the rise of the Phrygian kingdom. If so, they represent another reminder that Phrygian culture was never completely isolated, but instead developed upon foundations laid by earlier civilizations that had occupied Anatolia for centuries. Taken together, these scattered survivals paint a fascinating picture. The overwhelming majority of the population had adopted Greek names, and many families also embraced Latin ones. Yet, beneath this new cultural landscape remained small but persistent traces of the older Phrygian world. Ancient names continued to appear, particularly in rural districts where traditional ways of life survived longest. These remnants may have represented only a small percentage of the total population, but they demonstrate that local identity was never completely erased. There is, however, an important limitation to the evidence. Nearly everything historians know comes from inscriptions commissioned by families wealthy enough to afford stone monuments. The poorest members of society rarely left written records behind. As a result, we cannot know whether ordinary villagers preserved traditional names and customs more successfully than the local elites whose monuments dominate the archaeological record. It is entirely possible that aspects of Phrygian culture survived much more strongly among people whose voices have simply been lost to history. The continued use of the Phrygian language offers another clue. A number of communities still wrote funerary inscriptions or protective curses in Phrygian during the Roman period, showing that the language itself had not disappeared entirely. Yet even these communities usually combined Phrygian with Greek names rather than preserving an exclusively native naming tradition. Their cultural identity therefore became increasingly bilingual and multicultural instead of remaining purely indigenous. This gradual transformation contrasts sharply with neighboring regions such as Timbriada in Pisidia. There, local communities continued using their native language while almost completely resisting Greek and Latin personal names. Phrygia followed a different path. Although its people maintained elements of their ancestral identity, they adopted foreign naming customs much more readily, creating a society in which Greek language and culture coexisted with older local traditions rather than replacing them entirely. The reasons for this difference lie largely in geography and history. Unlike the isolated mountain districts of Pisidia, Phrygia occupied one of the richest and most strategically important regions of Anatolia. The fertile Sangarios Basin had supported the ancient Phrygian kingdom and remained one of the great agricultural heartlands of Asia Minor. Such wealth inevitably attracted conquerors. Persians, Macedonians, Hellenistic rulers, Galatians, and Romans all fought to control the region, each introducing new populations, new institutions, and new political systems. The Roman Empire intensified these changes even further. Large imperial estates spread across much of Phrygia, while wealthy landowners controlled enormous agricultural properties worked by local laborers. Successive wars, especially those of the 1st century BC, devastated large areas through destruction, plunder, forced migration, and economic disruption. Entire communities were displaced, families were separated, and populations mixed with newcomers arriving from many different parts of the empire. Over 6 or 7 centuries, these repeated upheavals transformed the cultural landscape of Phrygia. Old villages disappeared, new settlements emerged, and generations grew up speaking different languages from their ancestors. Such conditions naturally encouraged the gradual disappearance of many traditional customs, including older systems of personal names. Cultural continuity became increasingly difficult as communities experienced repeated waves of conquest, colonization, and migration. Yet despite everything, Phrygian identity endured. It survived not because ancient customs remained unchanged, but because local communities continually adapted while preserving selected elements of their heritage. Their language faded, their names changed, and foreign rulers governed their land for centuries. Even so, memories of the past remained alive in religious traditions, local cults, surviving personal names, and the enduring attachment of rural communities to their homeland. In the end, Roman Phrygia was neither entirely Greek nor entirely Roman, nor even entirely Phrygian in the old sense. It had become a society shaped by centuries of cultural exchange, conquest, and adaptation. Beneath the overwhelming influence of Greek and Roman civilization, fragments of the ancient Phrygian world continued to survive. Small, sometimes barely visible, yet remarkably resilient reminders of a people who never completely lost their identity. By the beginning of the Roman imperial period, Phrygia was undergoing one of the most significant transformations in its long history. During the late Hellenistic age, much of the region remained sparsely populated and overwhelmingly rural. Archaeological evidence from this period is relatively limited, suggesting that many communities were still small and scattered across the Anatolian countryside. Yet during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, this picture changed dramatically. Existing settlements expanded, entirely new towns emerged, and large imperial estates spread across the region. As these developments strengthened connections between local communities and the Roman provincial administration, Phrygia began leaving behind an increasingly rich archaeological record. Among the most distinctive remains from this period are the region's remarkable funerary monuments. Thousands of stone grave markers survive across Roman Phrygia, varying greatly in size, decoration, and style from one district to another. More than simple memorials, these monuments served as public statements about the identity of the deceased and the social values of the families who commissioned them. Their carvings reveal occupations, religious beliefs, wealth, education, and local traditions, offering an unusually detailed window into everyday life. One particular type of monument came to define Roman Phrygia more than any other. Modern archaeologists call them doorstones. These monuments display carved false doors on their front surfaces, giving the impression that the deceased stood behind a symbolic entrance separating the world of the living from that of the dead. Doorstones are found almost nowhere outside Phrygia, making them one of the region's most distinctive artistic traditions. Although scholars have catalogued hundreds of examples and identified numerous local workshops responsible for producing them, their exact symbolic meaning remains debated. Rather than viewing them simply as ethnic symbols identifying someone as Phrygian, many historians now interpret them as expressions of local identity that reflected the changing social world of Roman Anatolia. The earliest known examples appeared during the 1st century AD at Aizanoi. At this time, Aizanoi was rapidly developing into one of the most prosperous cities in inland western Anatolia. Wealthy local families commissioned elaborate funerary monuments unlike anything previously seen in the region. These early doorstones probably formed part of substantial stone tombs, rather than standing independently as isolated memorials. Some archaeologists believe they deliberately imitated much older funerary traditions from neighboring Lydia, allowing newly prominent urban elites to present themselves as descendants of an ancient and noble past. In other words, these monuments did more than commemorate the dead. They also proclaimed the social prestige of the living. One famous example belonged to Asclepiades II Carax, one of Aizanoi's most influential citizens, and the benefactor responsible for donating the city's first marble temple. The inclusion of an impressive door facade within his monumental tomb emphasized not only personal wealth, but also civic status, family prestige, and connections to the city's emerging elite. From Aizanoi, the fashion spread steadily across Phrygia. Nearby districts such as the Tembris Valley and Dokimaion quickly adopted the new style, adapting it to local artistic traditions. During the 1st century AD, doorstones remained largely associated with wealthy urban families capable of constructing elaborate funerary complexes. By the 2nd century, however, they had become increasingly common among more modest households. Smaller grave stelae began incorporating the same symbolic false doors, allowing broader sections of society to participate in a tradition that had originally belonged to local elites. One exceptionally important example survives at Amorion. Unlike most doorstones, which were removed from their original settings and reused in later buildings, the monument at Amorion still preserves part of its original tomb. 2. Projecting pillars once flanked the central doorway, while stone lions rested above them as symbolic guardians protecting the entrance to the tomb. Discoveries such as this allow archaeologists to reconstruct how these impressive monuments originally appeared before centuries of reuse altered the archaeological landscape. The popularity of doorstones reached its height during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD. By this period, they had become the defining feature of funerary art across much of eastern Phrygia. Yet their distribution remained far from uniform. Large metropolitan centers such as Apamea and Hierapolis rarely adopted this style. Instead, doorstones flourished most strongly in smaller inland towns such as Aizanoi, Dokimaion, Akmoneia, and numerous communities scattered across the Phrygian highlands. This difference reflects broader social contrasts within Roman Phrygia. The prosperous cities of the Maiander and Lycus valleys maintained closer commercial and cultural connections with the wider Mediterranean world. Their wealthy citizens increasingly commissioned luxurious marble sarcophagi modeled upon artistic fashions spreading throughout the Roman Empire. By contrast, the more isolated communities of the Phrygian interior developed distinctive local traditions that combined Roman influences with older regional customs. Even within Aizanoi itself, this contrast is visible. The richest families eventually abandoned traditional doorstones in favor of magnificent marble sarcophagi produced in the famous workshops of Dokimaion. These monumental tombs represented an even more expensive form of elite self-representation, demonstrating how funerary architecture reflected social hierarchy as much as artistic taste. Regional styles also developed with remarkable individuality. Doorstones carved at Dokimaion often borrowed architectural features directly from the marble sarcophagi produced in the city's imperial quarries. Horizontal lintels, carefully proportioned columns, decorative friezes, and standing human figures reveal strong connections with broader Greco-Roman artistic traditions. Elsewhere, however, local workshops emphasize different priorities. In the Upper Tembris Valley, richly decorated grave stelae featured geometric patterns, floral ornamentation, and guardian lions carved in relatively shallow relief. Over time, the symbolic doorway itself gradually disappeared, replaced by increasingly elaborate sculptural scenes framed within architectural niches. By the early 3rd century AD, these niche stelae had largely replaced the older doorstone tradition across several districts of eastern Phrygia. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these monuments lies in the objects carved upon them. Nearly every doorstone depicts items taken directly from everyday life. Some commemorate agricultural work through plows, pruning hooks, livestock, carts, and farming equipment. Others celebrate craftsmanship by illustrating professional tools belonging to stonemasons, blacksmiths, or other skilled workers. Alongside these practical objects appear symbols associated with Greek education and urban culture. Scrolls, writing tablets, athletic equipment, and strigils, the curved instruments used by athletes after exercise, suggest familiarity with the ideals of Greek paideia. These carvings indicate that many families wish to present themselves not only as hardworking farmers or craftsmen, but also as respectable participants in the civic culture of the Roman world. Interestingly, these educational symbols appear far more frequently in rural districts than in larger urban centers. Some scholars have questioned whether these images truly reflect everyday life or instead represent aspirations toward an educated lifestyle that many villagers never fully experienced. Yet there is little reason to dismiss them as mere fantasy. Just as the agricultural tools carved upon these monuments almost certainly belong to real occupations, the repeated appearance of writing materials and athletic equipment probably reflects genuine admiration for literacy, education, and civic participation, even if these ideals were unevenly distributed throughout society. Taken together, the doorstones of Roman Phrygia reveal a society balancing two worlds at once. On one side stood farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, and village communities whose daily lives remained deeply connected to agriculture and local tradition. On the other stood citizens increasingly participating in the political and cultural life of the Roman Empire, adopting Greek education, Roman civic ideals, and new forms of public self-representation. Rather than choosing one identity over the other, the people of Roman Phrygia embraced both. Their funerary monuments celebrated productive labor alongside literacy, local tradition alongside imperial culture, and rural values alongside urban ambition. In doing so, these remarkable stone doorways became far more than decorative tomb markers. They became enduring symbols of a society whose identity was shaped not by abandoning its past, but by carefully blending it with an ever-changing Roman world. As Roman influence spread across Phrygia, funerary monuments became increasingly sophisticated, but they also became more diverse. While Western Phrygia developed a remarkable variety of tomb styles that reflected differences in wealth and social standing, Eastern Phrygia followed a far more uniform tradition. Here, especially during the late 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, one form dominated almost every cemetery: the monumental doorstone. The classic example comes from the city of Amorion. Its best preserved monument consists of a large carved doorway framed by two projecting pillars, creating the appearance of the entrance to an impressive stone building. In smaller monuments, these pillars sometimes incorporated sculpted guardian lions, while in other cases the entire facade was carved from a single massive block of stone. Although many of these monuments originally stood before carefully constructed stone tombs, archaeologists believe that numerous examples were also attached to simpler rubble-built graves, and in some districts they were even carved directly into the surrounding rock. Excavations at Pessinus reveal a similar picture. Unfortunately, nearly all of the surviving doorstones there had been reused in later burials during late antiquity, making it difficult to determine precisely how they originally stood within the Roman cemetery. Even so, the evidence confirms that this distinctive architectural tradition had spread widely across Eastern Phrygia. Interestingly, these monuments were not equally popular everywhere. In the southern regions around Pisidian Antioch and Laodicea Katakekaumene, doorstones appear frequently throughout the surrounding countryside, but are surprisingly rare inside the cities themselves. The same pattern can be observed in the prosperous urban centers of the Maeander and Lycus valleys, where different forms of funerary architecture became fashionable instead. Geography played a decisive role in shaping these regional traditions. At Achaemenea and Sebaste, situated close to the Phrygian highlands, doorstones formed a major part of local burial customs. Yet only a short distance away at Eumenea, whose cultural and commercial connections tied it more closely to the fertile Maeander Valley, funerary altars rather than doorstones became the preferred monument. Even neighboring communities therefore developed noticeably different visual languages for commemorating their dead. The mountainous districts of northern Phrygia present another fascinating variation. Instead of constructing freestanding doorstones, many communities carved elaborate tombs directly into the cliffs themselves. These rock-cut monuments often featured architectural facades complete with symbolic doorways, columns, and decorative reliefs. Some, like the famous lion tomb at Iazin, display impressive sculptural decoration, while others remain comparatively simple. Despite their different appearance, They served exactly the same purpose as the freestanding doorstones found elsewhere across Phrygia. They proclaimed social status. Whether carved into solid rock or erected before masonry tombs, these monuments announced the prestige of the families buried within them. The spread of doorstones closely followed the growth of urban life. The earliest examples appeared during the 1st century AD in rapidly developing cities such as Aizanoi and Dokimaion. During the 2nd century, the tradition gradually expanded eastward into communities including Amorian and Pessinus. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, doorstones had become the standard form of funerary monument across much of the Anatolian plateau. Ironically, this expansion occurred just as wealthier Western cities were beginning to abandon them. In places like Aizanoi, the richest families increasingly preferred luxurious marble sarcophagi inspired by the magnificent tombs of Hierapolis. Meanwhile, Eastern Phrygia enthusiastically embraced the older doorstone tradition, transforming it into the principal symbol of prestige throughout the region. At the same time, production expanded dramatically. Families of more modest means, especially in rural communities, began commissioning simpler versions of the same monuments, allowing a much broader section of society to participate in what had once been an elite custom. A comparison with Roman sarcophagi makes this development even clearer. Across the wealthy lowlands of the Meander and Lycus valleys, marble sarcophagi dominated elite burial practices. High-quality examples, many imported from famous workshops at Aphrodisias or Dokimaion, became symbols of urban prosperity and close integration with Mediterranean artistic traditions. The situation differed greatly in central Phrygia. Here, locally produced sarcophagi often appeared alongside traditional doorstones rather than replacing them. Some sarcophagi even incorporated carved false doors, blending two separate funerary traditions into a uniquely Phrygian style. Instead of copying the fashions of coastal cities outright, inland communities adapted them to fit their own cultural landscape. For many years, historians regarded these doorstones as evidence that inland Phrygia remained isolated, conservative, and culturally backward. Today, archaeologists see them very differently. Rather than symbols of provincial simplicity, they are increasingly understood as expressions of civic identity. Local elites adopted these monuments to display their position within growing urban communities, while prosperous farmers, craftsmen, and merchants later followed the same tradition as cities expanded throughout the interior. Doorstones therefore reflected participation in Roman civic life rather than resistance to it. Yet beneath this broader Roman identity survived unmistakably Phrygian traditions. Many Greek funerary inscriptions conclude with protective curses warning anyone who might disturb the grave. In central and eastern Phrygia, these warnings sometimes end not in Greek at all, but in the Neo-Phrygian language. More than 100 examples of these inscriptions survive, and roughly 1/3 appear on doorstones themselves. Their continued use demonstrates that, although Greek had become the language of public life, the ancient Phrygian language still retained sacred authority, especially in matters concerning the protection of the dead. Religious imagery tells a similar story. One particularly remarkable doorstone from the Tembris Valley depicts the mother goddess Cybele standing between two lions. This composition deliberately echoes monumental rock sanctuaries created more than 600 years earlier during the Iron Age, including the famous shrine at Arslankaya. Such imagery was not accidental. By reviving ancient religious symbols within Roman funerary art, local communities established a visible connection between themselves and their distant Phrygian ancestors. Notably, these distinctly Phrygian elements appear almost exclusively within religious contexts. Both the Neo-Phrygian curses and the images of Cybele were intended to protect the tomb, suggesting that ancient cultural traditions survived most strongly in matters of sacred belief rather than everyday public life. Questions of identity become even more fascinating when we examine how the Phrygians presented themselves publicly. Ancient historians mention a lost historical work known as the Phrygiaca, written by the sophist Metrophanes of Eucarpaia during the 3rd century AD. Although the text itself has disappeared, Its very existence shows that educated Phrygians were actively preserving and celebrating their own regional history. At the same time, cities throughout Phrygia began issuing coins that proudly displayed the name of the koinon of Phrygia, while others portrayed the personification of Phrygia itself as a recognizable province within the Roman world. These were powerful public declarations that Phrygian identity remained meaningful centuries after the kingdom itself had vanished. Local mythology reinforced this identity even further. Many Phrygian cities claimed descent from legendary heroes associated with Homer's Iliad. Kings such as Midas, warriors like Atreus and Mygdon, and figures connected with the Trojan War appeared frequently on civic coinage. These heroes served as symbolic founders whose stories linked local communities to the heroic age celebrated throughout Greek literature. By presenting themselves as descendants of Homeric heroes, Phrygian cities achieved two important goals at once. They demonstrated their antiquity while simultaneously placing themselves within the prestigious cultural world shared by the Greeks and Romans. The legends did not end there. Ancient traditions claimed that the Phrygians had originally migrated from the Balkans, where they had once been known as the Phrygians. Other stories celebrated them as one of the oldest peoples on Earth, preserving one of humanity's earliest languages. Local flood myths connected Phrygia with famous stories such as those of Deucalion, Noah, and King Midas, while cities like Apamea proudly depicted these legends on their coinage. Every community adapted mythology to strengthen its own local identity. Perhaps the most remarkable example concerns the Trojans. By the Roman period, Phrygians increasingly identified themselves with Troy and its legendary heroes. Through Aeneas and his son Ascanius, believed to be ancestors of the Julian family and therefore of the Roman emperors themselves, Phrygia acquired a prestigious place within Rome's own foundation story. Some cities even struck coins, showing Aeneas escaping the burning city of Troy while carrying his father Anchises and leading young Ascanius by the hand. In doing so, they connected their own local traditions directly to the origins of the Roman Empire. Other legendary figures received equally positive treatment. King Midas appeared not as the foolish ruler with donkey ears familiar from Greek mythology, but as a wise founder and heroic king. Marsyas, who in Greek myth was defeated and punished by Apollo, became instead a source of civic pride at Apamea, where local traditions claimed his musical contest had taken place. Coins celebrated him as a musician, a river god, and even a protector whose music once saved the city from invasion. These stories reveal something essential about Roman Phrygia. Its people did not simply preserve ancient traditions unchanged, nor did they abandon them in favor of Greek or Roman culture. Instead, they carefully reshaped their own past, selecting myths, heroes, and symbols that presented Phrygia as an ancient, honorable, and civilized land fully deserving of its place within the Roman world. Through monuments, inscriptions, and civic coinage, they created an identity that was simultaneously local, Greek, and Roman, an identity rooted in the past but confidently expressed within the empire of the present. Religion played a central role in shaping local identity throughout Roman Phrygia. While political boundaries shifted repeatedly under Persian, Macedonian, Hellenistic, and Roman rule, sacred traditions remained remarkably stable. Every district developed its own gods, sanctuaries, festivals, and religious customs, giving each community a unique identity while simultaneously reinforcing a broader sense of belonging to the land of Phrygia itself. Among the most important of these regional cults was the worship of the mother goddess. At Pessinus, Docimaion, and throughout the Phrygian highlands, she was revered as Meta Agdistis, one of the oldest and most sacred deities of the region. Closely associated with her was Attis, whose legendary death and rebirth became one of the defining myths of Phrygian religion. Even centuries after the Roman conquest, these ancient traditions continued attracting worshippers from across Anatolia, demonstrating how deeply rooted indigenous beliefs remained within local society. Other communities developed their own distinctive versions of the mother goddess. At Aizanoi, she was worshipped as Meta Stunain, a uniquely local deity whose sanctuary stood inside a cave outside the city rather than within its urban center. Over time, local traditions identified her with the Greek goddess Rhea, creating a remarkable blend of indigenous and Greek religious beliefs. According to local mythology, Zeus himself was born near Aizanoi, making Meta Stuneni not only the city's protector, but also the divine mother of its chief god. This story appeared repeatedly on local coinage, proudly advertising the city's sacred traditions throughout the Roman world. Similar attempts to connect local mythology with Greek religion can also be seen at Achaemenea, Laodicea, Apamea, and Synoda, where civic coinage celebrated uniquely Phrygian versions of familiar Greek myths. Outside Phrygia, the mother goddess, known to the Greeks as Cybele, became the region's best-known deity. Within Phrygia itself, however, religious life was much more diverse. Male deities, especially different local forms of Zeus, occupied an equally important place in everyday worship. Nearly every district honored its own version of Zeus, often distinguished by a local title reflecting the landscape or particular community in which he was worshipped. These local gods demonstrate that religion in Phrygia was highly decentralized. Rather than depending upon a single universal cult, every valley and town developed sacred traditions uniquely its own. One particularly important sanctuary stood north of modern Chal, overlooking a great bend of the Meander River. Here, Apollo Lerbanos and Mytilete were worshipped together in a rural sanctuary closely connected with the nearby city of Hierapolis. Hundreds of inscriptions discovered at the site reveal extraordinary devotion among ordinary worshippers. Many belong to the remarkable confession inscriptions found throughout Phrygia, in which individuals publicly acknowledged wrongdoing, described divine punishment that had followed, and expressed gratitude after receiving forgiveness. These texts reveal an intensely personal relationship between humans and the gods. Rather than viewing religion merely as participation in public ceremonies, worshippers believed the gods actively observed everyday behavior. Dishonesty, broken promises, ritual impurity, or moral failures could all provoke divine punishment. Illness, misfortune, or other hardships were often interpreted as visible signs that a deity had intervened directly in human life. Through public confession and renewed devotion, individuals hoped to restore harmony with both the gods and their local community. This deep religious commitment also shaped how outsiders viewed the Phrygians. Although certain aspects of their religion appeared strange to Greeks and Romans, especially the self-castrating priests of Cybele known as the Galli, the Phrygians also gained a reputation as gifted prophets and interpreters of divine signs. Ancient authors frequently associated them with dreams, omens, and prophecy, believing that the people of Phrygia possessed exceptional spiritual insight. Their sacred traditions therefore inspired both admiration and curiosity throughout the Roman Empire. Religion also preserved the last surviving traces of the ancient Phrygian language. Although Greek had become the dominant language of administration, education, and public life, the Old Phrygian tongue did not disappear completely. Neo-Phrygian inscriptions continued to appear in selected regions of Western Anatolia, particularly on funerary monuments. Almost all of these surviving texts consist of short protective curses intended to guard graves against desecration. This limited survival is highly significant. By the Roman period, anyone fortunate enough to receive formal education almost certainly learned to read and write Greek rather than Phrygian. Greek, therefore, became the language of government, commerce, literature, and public inscriptions. The native language survived almost exclusively within sacred ritual. Families evidently believed that ancient Phrygian words possessed special religious authority when protecting the dead, even if those same families spoke and wrote Greek in most other aspects of life. The language itself gradually ceased to function as an everyday means of communication while continuing to survive as a sacred language reserved for the most solemn religious purposes. For many Greek and Roman writers, however, Phrygia remained a land apart. They consistently portrayed it as rural, distant, and lacking the sophisticated urban culture that defined the great cities of the Mediterranean. Compared with Ephesus, Smyrna, or Pergamon, inland Phrygia seemed remote and unsophisticated. Even as Roman roads, civic institutions, and monumental architecture transformed parts of the region, outsiders continued viewing Phrygia as fundamentally agricultural and provincial. Modern archaeology presents a much more complicated picture. Distinctive monuments such as doorstones and Neo-Phrygian inscriptions certainly flourished in many rural districts, seemingly supporting the traditional image of a conservative countryside. Yet a closer examination reveals something unexpected. These monuments appear most frequently not in isolated villages untouched by Roman civilization, but in communities actively undergoing urbanization. Doorstones, Greek inscriptions combined with Phrygian curse formulas, and other characteristic local traditions became especially popular among social groups that were gradually entering the civic world of the Roman Empire. Rather than representing resistance to urban life, they accompanied participation in it. Local elites, prosperous farmers, merchants, and craftsmen embraced Roman civic institutions while simultaneously preserving visible expressions of regional identity. Even more revealing is the geographical distribution of explicitly Phrygian identity. The strongest evidence does not come from the most isolated parts of the plateau, but from the highly developed cities of western Phrygia, particularly around the upper Meander Valley. There, civic coinage proudly displayed personifications of Phrygia, legendary founders, local myths, and indigenous deities alongside traditional Greek iconography. Apamea provides perhaps the clearest example. Originally founded on the site of ancient Kellenai, once the capital of Greater Phrygia, the city proudly presented itself as the symbolic center of Roman Phrygia. Several series of coins were issued in the name of the Koinon of Phrygia, a provincial federation that publicly celebrated the region's shared identity. Through these coins, local elites expressed pride not only in their individual city, but also in belonging to the wider historical landscape of Phrygia. This distinction is important. Doorstones themselves were not necessarily symbols of ethnic identity. Instead, they primarily reflected social status and participation in the growing civic culture of Roman Anatolia. The more explicit expressions of Phrygian identity appeared elsewhere, in myths, religious traditions, civic coinage, local foundation legends, and public cults. Mythology proved especially powerful. Cities proudly claimed descent from heroes mentioned in Homer's Iliad, celebrated King Midas as a noble founder, honored Marsyas as a local hero rather than a defeated satyr, and connected themselves with the legendary history of Troy. These stories allowed local communities to present themselves as both authentically Phrygian and fully integrated into the prestigious cultural world shared by Greeks and Romans. Religion offered perhaps the most effective language for expressing this identity. Political independence had disappeared centuries earlier, but local gods remained. Sacred mountains, caves, rivers, sanctuaries, and ancient festivals continued linking communities to their ancestral landscape. Because religion was respected throughout the Roman Empire, these traditions provided an acceptable and even prestigious way for local populations to preserve memories of their own past without challenging imperial authority. Ultimately, the archaeology of Roman Phrygia reveals something far more sophisticated than a simple contrast between Roman civilization and native tradition. Urbanization and local identity developed side by side rather than opposing one another. As cities expanded, civic institutions flourished, and Greek culture spread across the region, Phrygians did not abandon their heritage. Instead, they expressed it through the very cultural forms the Roman world valued most: public religion, civic mythology, monumental art, and local history. Their identity therefore survived not in isolation from the Roman Empire, but within it, carefully adapted to a new political world while remaining firmly rooted in the sacred landscape of ancient Phrygia. The funerary reliefs of Roman Phrygia provide one of the richest visual records of everyday life anywhere in the ancient world. Few other regions have preserved such a large and diverse collection of monuments depicting ordinary people rather than only kings, governors, or wealthy aristocrats. These reliefs survive in remarkable condition, largely because of two fortunate circumstances. First, the region possessed exceptionally high-quality white marble that preserved even the finest carved details. Second, the vast imperial quarries at Dokimaion produced enormous quantities of stone, making marble affordable not only for wealthy elites, but also for farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary village families. As a result, thousands of people from different levels of society commissioned their own funerary and votive monuments, leaving behind an unusually complete picture of life in Roman Phrygia. Unlike the funerary monuments of many coastal Greek cities, which primarily commemorate wealthy urban elites, the Phrygian reliefs represent an extraordinary cross-section of society. Farmers, shepherds, artisans, merchants, soldiers, women, children, and entire families appear side by side. Although these monuments served both religious and funerary purposes, they shared two defining characteristics: detailed carved portraits and carefully composed inscriptions. Together, they reveal how the inhabitants of Phrygia wished to be remembered long after their deaths. One striking feature of these monuments is their highly organized composition. Many reliefs divide the stone into several horizontal registers stacked one above another. At first glance, these scenes appear simply decorative, but closer examination suggests a carefully ordered vision of the universe. The upper sections usually depict major gods such as Zeus, Helios, Demeter, Hecate, or the local moon god Men. Beneath them stand the deceased and their family members, while the lowest registers often contain oxen, horses, or other domestic animals. Whether this arrangement represents the physical structure of the universe or a symbolic hierarchy remains uncertain. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Gods occupy the highest realm, humans stand beneath divine protection, and the animals that sustained everyday life form the foundation of the visible world. These monuments therefore reveal not only artistic preferences, but also how Phrygians understood the relationship between heaven, humanity, and nature. Equally revealing are the personal belongings carved beside the deceased. Almost every monument includes carefully selected objects intended to summarize an individual's life. These items were not random decorations, but visual biographies. For women, the emphasis falls upon domestic skill and personal dignity. Wool baskets, spinning tools, weaving combs, looms, mirrors, perfume bottles, cosmetic containers, and hair combs appear repeatedly. Together, they celebrate industry within the household while also emphasizing careful personal appearance. The ideal Phrygian woman was remembered not only as hardworking, but also as respectable, orderly, and well-presented. The objects accompanying men tell a rather different story. Alongside scrolls, writing tablets, and styluses, symbols of literacy and education, appear pruning hooks, axes, agricultural tools, and equipment connected with farming. This combination is particularly remarkable because similar monuments elsewhere in the Greek world rarely portrayed respectable men engaged in manual labor. In Roman Phrygia, however, physical work was not considered incompatible with education or social respectability. Instead, literacy and productive labor were presented as complementary virtues. A successful man was expected to cultivate both his land and his mind. Animals occupy an equally important place throughout these reliefs. Teams of oxen pulling plows appear so frequently that they became one of the defining symbols of Phrygian funerary art. Bulls, cows with calves, horses, donkeys, dogs, and other livestock regularly accompany the deceased, reminding viewers that agriculture and animal husbandry remained central to everyday existence. These creatures certainly possessed symbolic meaning, particularly in funerary contexts, but they also reflected the practical realities of rural life. Wealth, survival, and social standing all depended heavily upon successful farming and livestock breeding. The human figures themselves follow a distinctive artistic style. Nearly every portrait confronts the viewer directly with large, forward-facing eyes. Faces tend to be broad and rounded, with long noses, small mouths, and oversized heads that dominate relatively flat bodies. Men usually wear short hair, sometimes with neatly trimmed beards, while women almost always appear with long hair carefully arranged above their heads. Although these portraits rarely aim for realistic individual likenesses, they achieve something equally important: immediate visual recognition. Perhaps the most striking feature of all is the treatment of the hands. Both divine figures and ordinary people possess unusually large hands. Earlier scholars believed this simply reflected technical limitations, but the repeated appearance of oversized hands throughout the entire corpus suggests a deliberate artistic choice. The explanation may lie in Phrygian ideas about work. Hands are the instruments through which people create, cultivate, build, weave, harvest, write, and protect. By enlarging them, artists emphasized action rather than appearance. These were not idle individuals remembered merely for wealth or noble birth. They were people defined by what they accomplished. Even Zeus himself appears with similarly prominent hands, reinforcing the idea that divine and human virtue alike were expressed through meaningful action. In a society that placed exceptional value upon productive labor, emphasizing the hands made perfect symbolic sense. Clothing also carried important social meaning. One of the most common portrait types shows the deceased with one arm folded across the chest beneath a heavy cloak, a pose originally borrowed from Hellenistic honorific statues. Throughout the Greek world, this posture symbolized self-control, dignity, and respectable public behavior. The Phrygians adopted this prestigious artistic convention but adapted it to their own values. Unlike earlier Greek examples, which often concealed the hands beneath folds of cloth, Phrygian sculptors deliberately displayed large open hands resting across the chest or hanging beside the body. These hands frequently hold objects such as scrolls, spindles, or other personal possessions, reinforcing the impression that character was demonstrated through useful activity rather than passive elegance. Men and women alike appear in this pose, demonstrating another distinctive aspect of Phrygian society. The visual language of respectability applied equally to both sexes. While their accompanying objects differed according to traditional gender roles, both men and women were portrayed as disciplined, productive, and honorable members of their communities. Taken together, these remarkable monuments reveal a society with values quite different from those often celebrated elsewhere in the Roman Empire. Military glory, political ambition, and extravagant luxury rarely dominate the imagery. Instead, the reliefs consistently honor family, agriculture, craftsmanship, education, religion, and honest labor. Gods watch over the world from above, ordinary people occupy its center, and the animals that sustain life remain inseparable from human existence. Far from being simple gravestones, these reliefs function as carefully constructed visual biographies. Every portrait, every agricultural tool, every scroll, every spindle, every ox, and every carefully carved hand tells the same story. The people of Roman Phrygia wished to be remembered not primarily for wealth or power, but for the lives they had lived, the work they had accomplished, and the communities to which they had faithfully belonged. Military imagery occupies a surprisingly important place in the funerary monuments of Roman Phrygia, although it presents a very different picture from the heroic warrior traditions familiar elsewhere in the Roman world. Only a relatively small number of reliefs portray men dressed as soldiers, and almost all belong to the finest monuments from the Upper Tembris Valley. These figures wear long pleated tunics over fitted undergarments, fastened with broad sashes and narrow belts, while carrying weapons such as spears, shields, and occasionally curved swords or scabbards. Their equipment varies from monument to monument, suggesting differences in rank, wealth, or personal preference rather than a standardized military uniform. Yet what makes these soldiers remarkable is not their military equipment, but the company it keeps. Around these armed figures appear grapevines, plows, hunting dogs, scrolls, writing tablets, and styluses. Rather than celebrating warfare alone, these monuments combine military service with farming, education, and literacy into a single portrait of respectable manhood. One relief illustrates this ideal particularly well. The deceased stands armed with spear and shield, yet beside him appears a plow, while grapevines decorate the frame, and a hunting dog proudly carries game beneath his arm. The message is unmistakable. A respected Phrygian gentleman could defend his community, cultivate his land, enjoy the pleasures of rural life, and still possess the education expected of an accomplished citizen. Soldiering did not replace agriculture or learning. Instead, all three formed complementary parts of an honorable life. The presence of writing equipment beside armed men is especially significant. Large writing tablets, scrolls, and stylus cases appear alongside military weapons, indicating that literacy carried considerable prestige. These monuments do not depict professional soldiers isolated from civilian society. Rather, they seem to represent local elites who combined several responsibilities at once. Such individuals may have served as civic officials, local magistrates, members of rural security forces, or commanders responsible for protecting their districts while simultaneously managing estates and participating in public administration. Military service, therefore, became only one aspect of a much broader social identity. Another remarkable monument illustrates this combination even more clearly. A funerary relief commissioned by a man named Papias depicts what appears to be the same family twice. In the upper register, the central male figure wears the elegant arm-sling costume associated with educated and respectable citizens, holding a scroll that symbolizes learning and public dignity. In the lower register, another nearly identical figure appears dressed as a soldier, complete with military cloak and sword. Whether these represent the same man portrayed in two different social roles or two closely related family members remains uncertain. Either interpretation leads to the same conclusion. Within Roman Phrygia, there was no contradiction between military service and intellectual cultivation. A man could simultaneously embody the ideals of soldier, landowner, administrator, and educated citizen. These roles reinforced rather than competed with one another. While military dress appears only on wealthier monuments, another distinctive costume dominates the simpler reliefs of central Phrygia. These men wear long hooded cloaks that cover almost the entire body, producing a broad, triangular silhouette. Earlier, scholars often described these figures simply as shepherds because similar garments resemble the heavy felt cloaks traditionally worn by Anatolian herdsmen. The archaeological evidence, however, suggests a much broader interpretation. These cloaks appear not only on isolated rural figures, but also beside wives, children, relatives, and neighbors. Children sometimes wear the same garments, while their fathers appear dressed differently. Groups of men wearing different styles of clothing frequently appear together on the same monument without any obvious social distinction between them. The cloak, therefore, cannot represent a single profession. Instead, it appears to symbolize respectable rural life itself. Much like traditional ceremonial dress in many cultures today, this hooded garment probably represented an idealized version of everyday clothing worn proudly on important public occasions. It reflected a shared rural identity rather than a specific occupation. Women appear less frequently than men on surviving reliefs, yet their portrayal reveals equally distinctive social values. Unlike male figures, who could be represented in several different visual styles, women almost always wear the same combination of chiton and himation. Their bodies remain fully covered, while most also wear veils draped over the head. Hairstyles remain remarkably consistent, usually featuring carefully parted hair gathered behind the head. Variation instead appears in subtle details. Decorative headbands, elegant veils, small necklaces, delicate earrings, and slight differences in hairstyle allowed individual identity to emerge without abandoning the highly conservative standards expected of respectable women. Perhaps most striking is what these women do not wear. Large necklaces, bracelets, rings, brooches, and other luxurious jewelry rarely appear. Rather than emphasizing wealth through personal ornament, Phrygian women were presented with modest elegance. Social prestige seems to have depended more upon the quality of the monument itself than upon extravagant displays of jewelry or fashionable clothing. The reliefs also reveal unusually balanced relationships between husbands and wives. In many monuments, men and women stand at exactly the same height, adopting identical poses with neither figure visually dominating the composition. This equality contrasts sharply with many earlier Hellenistic artistic traditions where female figures often occupied more passive or subordinate positions. Here, husband and wife appear as partners. Although traditional gender roles remained clearly defined through clothing and personal objects, both sexes received equal visual dignity. Productive labor, family responsibility, and respectability formed shared values rather than exclusively masculine virtues. Family itself occupies the very center of Phrygian visual culture. Unlike many Hellenistic monuments, which typically portrayed isolated individuals, Phrygian reliefs frequently include husbands, wives, children, siblings, and sometimes several generations within a single composition. Children stand beside their parents rather than appearing separately, emphasizing family unity above individual achievement. Children are usually distinguished only by their smaller size. Otherwise, they dress much like adults and adopt many of the same poses. Rather than creating a separate visual language for childhood, Phrygian artists portrayed children as future adults whose identities had not yet been completed. They lacked the agricultural tools, scrolls, mirrors, or other personal objects that characterized mature life, but otherwise already belonged fully within the family unit. Perhaps the most touching feature of these monuments is the frequent use of physical contact. Parents place hands upon their children's shoulders. Husbands gently rest hands upon their wives. Mothers hold the hands of sons and daughters. Entire families appear physically connected through chains of touching hands and arms. Such gestures were extremely unusual in earlier Greek funerary art, where individuals generally stood apart from one another in formal poses. In Roman Phrygia, however, physical affection became an accepted public symbol of family identity. These gestures transformed stone monuments into expressions of emotional relationships rather than simply records of ancestry. The reliefs suggest that belonging to a family was among the most important aspects of personal identity. Love, protection, cooperation, and mutual support were not private emotions hidden from public view, but values worthy of permanent commemoration in marble. Taken together, these monuments present an unusually coherent vision of Phrygian society. The ideal citizen was neither merely a soldier nor merely a farmer. He could cultivate his fields, defend his community, read and write, participate in local government, and remain devoted to his family. Women embodied modest dignity, domestic competence, and equal partnership within marriage. Children represented the future continuity of the household, while visible gestures of affection proclaimed the strength of family bonds. Far more than artistic decoration, these reliefs preserve the values of an entire civilization. They reveal a society that measured honor not simply through wealth or military achievement, but through productive work, education, family loyalty, and the quiet dignity of everyday rural life. The families portrayed on the funerary monuments of Roman Phrygia were often far more complex than they first appear. At first glance, many reliefs seem to depict nothing more than a husband, wife, and children standing together. Yet, when archaeologists compare the sculptures with their accompanying inscriptions, a much richer picture begins to emerge. These monuments frequently commemorated extended households that included brothers, sisters-in-law, adopted children, and several generations living under the same roof. In Roman Phrygia, the family extended well beyond the simple nuclear household familiar to the modern world. One remarkable monument illustrates this perfectly. The funerary stele dedicated to a woman named Tateis appears at first glance to commemorate only her and her son. The inscription, however, tells a far more complicated story. The monument was erected not by Tateis herself or even by her husband, but by her brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son, daughter-in-law, and an adopted son. This unexpected combination of relatives reveals several important features of Phrygian family life. First, marriage did not sever family ties, but instead expanded them. Once Tateis married into her husband's household, she became an integral member of that wider family. Even after her husband's death, his relatives continued to regard her as one of their own, taking responsibility for commemorating her memory. The inscription also reveals that she had both a biological son and an adopted son living at the time of her death. Adoption, therefore, formed a natural and accepted part of household organization rather than an unusual exception. This evidence also helps explain several monuments that had long puzzled archaeologists. One funerary relief commissioned by a man named Papias depicts two separate family groups, each with adults and children of similar ages. Earlier interpretations often assumed the sculptor had accidentally duplicated the same family or portrayed the same individuals twice. The inscriptions suggest a different possibility. Rather than representing one household, the monument may commemorate two closely related branches of a single extended family. Papias may have lived together with his brother's household under one roof, forming what historians sometimes describe as a joint family. As head of this larger household, he could naturally describe all its members as my own, even though they belonged to two separate nuclear families. Details within the relief support this interpretation. The children differ in gender, the women do not closely resemble one another, while the two adult men share similar facial features consistent with brothers. What first appears confusing, therefore, becomes entirely understandable once the broader structure of Phrygian family life is taken into account. These examples provide an important lesson for interpreting ancient art. Images alone rarely tell the complete story. Without the accompanying inscriptions, modern viewers might mistakenly identify husbands, wives, parents, and children according to modern assumptions about family structure. The written evidence repeatedly demonstrates that Roman Phrygian households could include adopted children, in-laws, brothers, sisters, and several generations living together. Family identity extended far beyond immediate parents and their children. This broader understanding helps explain many other distinctive features of Phrygian relief sculpture. At first glance, these monuments can appear surprisingly simple. Their broad faces, oversized heads, unusually large hands, and rigid frontal poses differ greatly from the elegant marble sculptures produced in the great cities of Asia Minor. Compared with the refined artistic traditions of Ephesus or Pergamon, Phrygian monuments have often been dismissed as provincial or unsophisticated. A closer look reveals something very different. Their unusual artistic style forms a visual language perfectly suited to expressing the values of rural Phrygian society. Every repeated pose, every carefully selected object, and every family grouping communicates ideas about work, community, and kinship rather than artistic realism alone. Clothing provides one revealing example. Two styles dominate male portraiture. Some men wear the elegant arm-sling costume borrowed from the urban Greek world, symbolizing education and respectable citizenship. Others proudly appear wrapped in the traditional Anatolian peasant cloak. Significantly, neither costume seems socially superior to the other. The two styles often appear together on the very same monument. Some families even combine both forms of dress among closely related individuals without suggesting any difference in social status. Rural clothing therefore carried no sense of embarrassment or inferiority. Instead, Phrygian communities comfortably combined Greek fashions with traditional Anatolian dress, expressing identities that were simultaneously local and connected to the wider Roman world. The same balance appears in the objects carved beside the deceased. These reliefs celebrate practical achievements above almost everything else. Men proudly display plows, pruning hooks, farming equipment, writing tablets, scrolls, and military equipment. Women appear beside looms, weaving tools, mirrors, combs, and cosmetic objects. These possessions do not simply identify occupations. Together, they proclaim diligence, productivity, and competence. Work itself becomes a source of honor. Whether cultivating fields, weaving cloth, reading documents, or serving the local community, individuals wish to be remembered for what they accomplished rather than for inherited privilege. Even the unusually large hands characteristic of Phrygian sculpture seem to reinforce this emphasis upon useful labor, suggesting that productive work stood at the center of personal identity. Above all, however, these monuments celebrate family. Not simply husbands and wives, but entire households bound together through marriage, adoption, kinship, and mutual responsibility. This emphasis appears visually as well as textually. Parents gently rest their hands upon children. Husbands touch their wives' shoulders. Family members stand physically connected rather than isolated from one another. Such gestures were relatively uncommon in earlier Greek funerary art, but became one of the defining characteristics of Phrygian relief sculpture. These acts of physical affection transformed stone monuments into lasting expressions of emotional attachment. Rather than presenting isolated individuals, the monuments consistently portray people as members of families whose relationships continued beyond death through memory, obligation, and shared identity. Taken together, The funerary monuments of Roman Phrygia preserve far more than portraits of the dead. They reveal the values by which an entire society wished to be remembered. Respectable clothing reflected both local traditions and wider Roman culture. Practical skills mattered more than luxury. Productive labor earned admiration regardless of gender. Extended families formed the basic foundation of everyday life, while adoption, marriage, and kinship created flexible households that reached far beyond the immediate family. Behind the distinctive artistic style of these monuments stand real men, women, and children whose lives were filled with work, cooperation, affection, and shared responsibility. Their reliefs remind us that the strength of Roman Phrygian society rested not in political power or military conquest, but in the resilience of its households, the dignity of everyday labor, and the enduring bonds that united families across generations.